You ready to go? Okay, we're back in session. Didn't make missed out by 7 minutes, my 1:30 date time. We're going to go to agenda item 11, California Resources Corporation LLC and North Kern Water Storage District Oil Field Produced Water Reclamation Project. And this is a WDR's amendment. This is the time and place for hearing to consider an order amending waste discharge requirements for California Resources Corporation LLC and North Kern Water Storage District Oil Field Produced Water Reclamation Project in Kern County. Is there anyone present who is contesting this matter? Okay, and wishes to present evidence or testimony on this matter, and I saw Bill's hand back there. Since there are persons present wishing to contest this item, we will proceed with the hearing. This hearing will be conducted in accordance with the notice of public hearing and the meeting procedures published with the meeting agenda. At this time, evidence should be introduced on whether the proposed action should be taken. All persons expecting to testify, please stand at this time, raise your right hand, and take the following oath. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth? If so, answer, I do. Thank you. The designated parties are California Resources Corporation, North Kern Water Storage District. The total times allowed for testimony are as follows. California Resources Corp., 3 minutes. North Kern Water Storage District, 3 minutes. All other persons are interested persons and shall limit their testimony to 3 minutes, and a timer, of course, will be used. Please state your name, address, affiliation, and whether you've taken the oath before testifying. Does council have any legal issues to discuss at this time?
Not at this time.
Thank you, Stephanie. We will now begin with a staff presentation.
Okay.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Chair Longley and members of the board. My name is Josh Mahoney, and I'm a water resource control engineer with your Fresno office, and I've taken the oath. Today, I'll be discussing the proposed amendment order for waste discharge requirements. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, today I'll be discussing the amendment order or the proposed amendment order for waste discharge requirements, order number R5-2015-0127. Today's presentation will cover the following items: background, the tentative order, comments received regarding the tentative order, and the proposed amendment order included in your agenda package. The WDRs regulate the reuse of produced wastewater from California Resources Corporations to North Kern Water Storage District's Rosedale Spreading Basin and the Leardo Canal. Produced wastewater from California Resources Corporation's produced wastewater treatment facility is of good quality and meets water quality objectives. The Rosedale Spreading Basin is located in the northwest corner of the aerial image displayed on the screen. Approximately 2.5 miles east of the Rosedale Spreading Basin is the produced wastewater mixing area in the Leardo Canal. The Rosedale Spreading Basin and the Leardo Canal discharge locations are approximately 1.5 miles outside of Bakersfield city limits. Produced wastewater is discharged to the Leardo Canal, where it is mixed with surface water from Kern River and groundwater. This mixture is referred to as blended produced wastewater. Blended produced wastewater in the Leardo Canal flows downstream where it is made available to farmers within North Kern Water Storage District service territory, consisting of approximately 55,000 acres of irrigated cropland. Blended produced wastewater in the Leardo Canal does not serve as a municipal or domestic water supply for the area. The Rosedale Spreading Basin is a groundwater recharge facility that spans 608 acres. During winter months, or when irrigation demands are low, produced wastewater is discharged to the Rosedale Spreading Basin. During wet years, Kern River water may also be discharged to the Rosedale Spreading Basin. The Water Quality Control Plan for the Tulare Lake Basin, hereafter referred to as the Basin Plan, identifies specific policies for the disposal of produced wastewater. The WDRs, as written, do not include all relevant and applicable policies identified in the oil-filled wastewater section of the Basin Plan. Due to this discovery, staff prepared a tentative order that would amend the WDRs to incorporate the relevant and applicable Basin Plan policies related to disposal of produced wastewater. Central Valley Water Board staff mailed the tentative amendment order to stakeholders and interested parties for public comment on 15 June 2017. This order proposed two new requirements that would amend the WDRs. The first proposed requirement is discharge specification C9 that states discharge areas shall be free of visible oil or oil accumulation or effectively netted to preclude the entry of wildlife. The second proposed requirement is provision E14 that states that discharges of oil-filled produced wastewater shall comply with all policies identified in the oil-filled wastewater section of the Basin Plan. The Central Valley Water Board received 4 comment letters by the comment period deadline. These comment letters were prepared by North Kern Water Storage District, California Resources Corporation, Center for Biological Diversity, and an environmental coalition that was submitted by Clean Water Action. The environmental group submitted a comment stating that proposed discharge specification C9 should require discharge areas to be free of oil and netted in lieu of being free of oil or netted to preclude the entry of wildlife. The environmental groups state that despite removing oil from produced wastewater, harmful chemicals may remain that pose a threat to the environment and wildlife. Staff concluded that modifying proposed discharge specification C9 to require discharge areas to be free of oil and netted is not appropriate based on the following. First is that the Rosedale Spreading Basin is a 608-acre groundwater recharge facility that would result in an unreasonable cost in relation to the benefits of netting the facility. Second is that produced wastewater discharged to these areas is of good quality and meets water quality objectives. Third is that the MRP requires quarterly produced wastewater, irrigation water, and groundwater monitoring. And last is that the Basin Plan states that the disposal of produced wastewater shall be either free of oil or netted. Due to these findings, staff did not change proposed discharge specification C9 in response to this comment from the environmental groups. In addition to this comment, environmental groups submitted additional comments that were not related to proposed discharge specification C9 and provision E14. As stated in the public comment letter, comments on other parts of the WDRs will not be accepted. Since these comments were not related to either of the proposed requirements, staff did not prepare a response. A copy of the original comment letters are available in your agenda package. California Resources Corporation submitted a comment stating that proposed provision E14 would result in redundant language in the WDRs. Proposed provision E14 would require the discharger to comply with the relevant and applicable policies identified in the oil-filled wastewater section of the Basin Plan. As explained in California Resources Corporation's comment, these policies are either already included in the WDRs or do not pertain to the discharge at the Rosedale Spreading Basin and the Leardo Canal. Central Valley Water Board staff agrees with California Resources Corporation's comment that proposed provision E14 is not required to maintain compliance with the Basin Plan. Proposed provision E14 has been removed from the tentative amendment order. The proposed amendment order available in your agenda package includes one new requirement, proposed discharge specification C9. Due to the comments received, proposed provision E14 has been removed. If this proposed amendment order is adopted today, California Resources Corporation and North Kern Water Storage District would be subject to the relevant and applicable policies identified in the Basin Plan for the disposal of produced wastewater. Staff recommends that the board adopt the proposed order amending the WDRs. This concludes my presentation. At this time, I'd like to enter this presentation and the case file into the record. Are there any questions?
Questions? Go ahead, Dan.
What were the root causes of this change?
This is Clay Rogers, Assistant Executive Officer. I think the root cause for us being back here today with this change is that we had identified an issue that caused us to look at the WDRs in detail and recognize that there was a shortcoming in the original order that was adopted. And so it was decided that we should reopen the order just for this very narrow issue and bring it back to the board for adoption.
It's really about safety to wildlife.
That is correct. The primary issue here is that we don't want to have birds that would basically be oiled and prevent that. We work with Fish and Wildlife very closely during the adoption and consideration or the preparation of these orders to ensure that wildlife is protected.
Any further questions? Thank you for your presentation. Is there someone here from California Resources Corp? Thank you. North Kern Water Storage District? I don't see a representative here. Bill? Elliot? We're going to interested persons now, so Bill Elliot.
Hi, I'm Bill Alio with the Environmental Working Group from Sacramento. I have taken the oath. I'm also representing Clean Water Action, Natural Resources Defense Council, and the Center for Environmental Health, which were 4 of us signed the letter about this amendment to the WDR. Perhaps I don't understand the process that well, because if it's in the Basin plan that you shall have no visible oil in the discharge or net it, why couldn't you just enforce that instead of amending the permit? And so it's really, I can't speak for the other 3 groups, my ignorance that I didn't know was already in the Basin plan. So when we saw this pop up as an amendment, to us it looked like an outright admission that the treated wastewater leaves this company, CRC, and we also understand Chevron's to the south with oil wastewater in it. People have observed it. I haven't been there myself. So you can see the oil, you smell the oil, and it shimmers as it's sometimes warm and also has volatile organic compounds coming from it. So it's an open admission that this is not well-treated wastewater. Now, it may meet certain contaminant levels, but we've been, in working with the Food Safety Panel, which is an adjunct part of this whole process of using treated wastewater to irrigate crops, it's been noted by the Food Safety Panel in a short report that there are major data gaps, including we don't know what chemicals are going into this waste stream, that Chevron says they're proprietary trade secret. We know there are certain ones, but we have found benzene in it in some early testing. We know there are a lot of unnamed chemicals. Certainly other forms of hydrocarbons are likely, especially given the admission that you shall net it. As far as netting goes, 688 acres is a small lake. They're really going to net it because over the area of Kern County, it's been noted as the staff finally looked into the issue of ponds in Kern County. There are about 900 waste ponds for oil, that many of the nets on those that are supposed to be there already, according to Dogger's Division of Oil and Gas's Public Resources Code section, that were torn and missing over probably decades. So we assume wildlife may avoid these areas because they smell and look like oil, but they may not. And that's why staff, I think, is doing its due diligence and saying, let's take care of the problem. So I guess saying we oppose the amendment is, it's a little obtuse because we think you should be enforcing the Basin Plan anyway through a WDR. And so specifically nailing it down in the permit, the WDR, is fine. But again, related back to this whole issue of food safety and irrigation, our stance has been, if it is shown that this treated wastewater is safe for watering food long-term, we have no problem with it. It is a good conjunctive use, as this board called it a couple of years ago. But you establish the Food Safety Panel because it is unknown if it is a good, safe use. Some preliminary, quick monitoring of the fruit and stuff says it probably looks okay, but soil hasn't been tested, Root crops haven't been tested. So we remain opposed to this amendment, opposed to the practice until it's proven safe. And that would be CRC's permit and the existing Chevron permit. Also, we hope if there's any more in the pipeline that they're told, the staff is advising them not to continue, not to appear before this board because you're still waiting for the issue of safety to be determined by your food safety panel. Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you for your testimony, Bill. Is there anyone else who wishes to testify on this issue? Seeing none, we'll go to closing statement by staff.
Hi, Dr. Longley. Clay Rogers, Assistant Executive Officer in Fresno again. I want to make one clarifying statement, and Mr. Elliot can correct me if I'm mistaken, but Mr. Elliot indicated that there was a report prepared by the Food Safety Panel, and I believe the report he's referring to was prepared by a current member of the Food Safety Panel and a former member of the Food Safety Panel, with the current member being Dr. Seth Shonkoff, the former member being Dr. Will Stringfellow. They put together a report that talked about the toxicity. They did that independently of the Food Safety Panel, and that report was not prepared by the Food Safety Panel itself. So I just wanted to clarify that issue. As far as this order goes, we felt it was appropriate to have it specifically spelled out in the waste discharge requirements and correct what we saw as a potential oversight from the past. And with that, staff recommends that the order be adopted as proposed. Thank you.
Clay, out of curiosity, Bill was speaking of a large number of ponds that are supposed to be netted that aren't.
Well, I mean, that's an interpretation. You could argue, that if there was potential for oil in all of these ponds, that all of the ponds that North Kern operates here could potentially be required to be netted. Most of these are actually operated in series where you get the discharge. They're not necessarily in parallel. They run from pond to pond to pond. And so if we have some accumulation of oil, and we do in some of these, it typically happens in the first pond because that's where the oil coagulates and would be accumulated on the surface. So we've gone out, we've inspected all of these ponds. We have looked to make sure that they comply with the basin plan. If they either don't have netting and there's oil, or if the netting does not appear to be adequate to prevent wildlife from getting into them, then we do issue notices of violation and work through the process to make sure that that is corrected.
Any, yes,
Carl?
Bob, go ahead.
I always get nervous around these discussions. I get nervous when people start talking about, we don't really know what's there because of preparatory chemicals that are used, and that's just a huge red flag to me. And I haven't seen this food safety report, and I know it's just 2 individuals, but I might be interested in having that information also, please.
Absolutely, we can provide that to you. I believe that report is actually available, and I'll look at Josh. It is available on our website under the oil-filled food safety portions on our website. So we have all of the information being collected available there. And I will say, we're working diligently to address the issues of any potential chemicals that could be present in this wastewater to ensure that we don't have unforeseen consequences from that. So there is some proposed legislation working through, and also we're working through to make sure that we have total knowledge. Part of that may end up being where these are actually trade secrets. we may be barred from sharing that information publicly. So we could end up in the future having a discussion here saying, we've looked at this, we've evaluated, we don't see an issue with it, but we're not able to be transparent and share that. If in fact those trade secret chemicals can survive the trade secret, if they reach that bar. And so, that will not provide a lot of satisfaction to some people, but we are working to diligently make sure that we address that specific question.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't understand why we have to play a guessing game about people's health with respect to chemicals that are in water that grow our food.
Well, I will say this, that, what we've got in a lot of the reports, we sent 13267 orders.
Clay, I really strongly support your and your staff's work and have full confidence that everything that can be done is being done, and I really do appreciate that. I mean, I think as one board member anyway, I very much in this discussion rely on your judgment and the expertise of our board. So, that while I get queasy thinking about the potential here, I also have a lot of faith in your work and appreciate it. So I'm kind of balancing those two out.
Just a thought, possibly the October meeting. I know it's probably fuller than you like it right now, but I think it's time for an update on the oil program.
October will be in Reading. It may be better to keep it for December. Just
A long
because of
ways
the,
off.
obviously we keep you updated with our EO report, but we can certainly have staff come up there. It's just that the parties then would have to travel to Reading, so I'm keeping in mind the distance they would have to travel.
I think we should go for December, but I think that's a good idea. And now the one test we have is that it's okay to eat this orange off this tree.
Yes, but they just sampled.
Yeah.
We do have the results back from citrus sampling that was conducted. I will tell you that a couple weeks ago, we were out sampling control fields for garlic. There is one field of root crops, garlic being grown. So we were out sampling garlic in some control sites that weren't irrigated a couple weeks ago. And I've actually had staff in Kern County this week sampling, and I'll look at it, garlic, almonds, grapes. Yeah, and we're getting scheduled to do pistachios and the others. So we're actually out collecting those fruit and nut samples now. The harvest has just begun for the grapes and the nuts.
And are we doing sampling for a cumulative over 2 or 3 years, just to start with anyway, or is that anticipated?
Well, I would anticipate that this isn't strictly a one-time sampling event. But that's something we'll have the food safety panel weigh in on as we get results and get their input.
And the other side of this, of course, is while we have a really wet year this year, in a drought, this water can be pretty critical to food supply, so.
So then if we do this in December, I would, but we've doing a lot of sampling now. I'd like to see pretty good discussion in the next EO report. So we have the basis of that, and we might be asking questions. I might be asking questions based upon the EO report.
Yeah, I agree with that, doing a little expansion of the EO report for the September
Yeah. The October
meeting and then go to December.
Okay.
We will do that.
We got a little bit off track here, so thank you for your closing statement. And we'll take a recommendation from the executive officer.
So Dr. Longley, Steph did this because I asked him to do it, but because there is a difference in the basin plan refers to sumps. These are spreading basins, so they don't fit sumps definition, and so that's why I asked staff to add some provisions to this order. So they did that, and we are very aware of the issues and concerns around food safety. So with that, I recommend adopting this order as proposed by staff in the agenda package.
Thank you. Any further questions, comments? I'll close the hearing. We'll deliberate, and we can talk to the advisory group certainly. And I'll entertain a motion.
I move that we adopt the proposed amendments to the waste discharge requirements.
I'll second that.
Are there leak revisions, or revisions rather? No revisions to it, good. So Denise has made the motion, Raji has seconded. Roll call, please.
Ms. Brower,
Yes.
Mr. Schneider, Dr. Markham,
Aye.
is Mr. Constantino? Okay. Ms. Kadara,
Yes.
Dr. Longley,
Yes?
motion carries.
Thank you very much. Moving on to item 10 on the agenda. This is a replacement.
Oh, good, good, good. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, as I stated, agenda item 10, amendment to the Basin plans to establish a region-wide municipal and domestic supply or MUN beneficial use evaluation process. This is the time and place for a hearing to consider a resolution amending the water quality control plans for the Sacramento-San Joaquin River and Tulare Lake Basins to establish a region-wide process to evaluate municipal and domestic supply beneficial uses in agriculturally dominated water bodies. The amendments would also de-designate municipal and domestic supply beneficial uses within 231 constructed or modified agriculturally dominated water bodies within the San Luis Canal Company service area. The board conducted a hearing to receive oral comments regarding the proposed Basin Plan amendment on February 23rd, 2013. This hearing will be conducted in accordance with the notice of public hearing and meeting procedures published with the meeting agenda. At this time, evidence should be introduced on whether the proposed action should be taken. All persons expecting to testify, please stand at this time, raise your right hand, and take the following oath. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth? If so, answer, I do. Thank you. Following the staff presentation, interested persons may speak for 3 minutes each, and a timer will be used. Please state your name, address, affiliation before speaking. Does council have any legal issues to discuss at this time?
Not at this time.
Thank you. We'll now begin with the staff presentation.
Good afternoon, Chair Longley and the members of the board. My name is Cindy Yao Young, and I am an environmental scientist in the Rancho Cordova office, and I have taken the oath. I am here today with Ann Littlejohn to discuss the proposed Basin Plan amendment to establish a region-wide process for evaluating the municipal and domestic supply, or MUN, beneficial use in agriculturally dominated surface water bodies. We came to the board several times over the last 2 years to discuss this project. Starting back in April 2015, the Central Valley Water Board adopted the Sacramento MUN Basin Plan Amendment, which removed the MUN use from 12 constructed or modified ag-dominated water bodies, receiving NPDES discharges from the cities of Biggs, Colusa, Live Oak, and Willows. The Sacramento project served as one of the case study for today's region-wide MUN evaluation project, which we also provided an overview to the board at the April 2015 meeting. We returned to the board a few more times to discuss the region-wide MUN evaluation project, including a workshop focused on the limited MUN or L-MUN beneficial use in July of 2015, and another workshop last year that focused on the implementation and key issues. In February of this year, we had the first hearing of the proposed Basin Plan amendments and received oral comments from both the public and board members. At this year's February board hearing, staff presented in detail the background on this project and the development of project alternatives, beneficial uses, implementation provisions, and monitoring and surveillance requirements. Today, I will provide a brief overview of these proposed amendments, and will then provide the second part of the presentation, which focuses on public comments we received and staff's responses, including any proposed revisions to either the amendment itself or the staff report. After Anne discusses the comments, she will conclude the presentation with staff's recommendations. We are here today to consider adopting an amendment to the basin plans to establish a consistent, transparent, and streamlined Central Valley-wide process for evaluating appropriate designations and level of protection of the immune beneficial use in ag-dominated surface water bodies. This process would only apply to the immune beneficial use, and it would not affect other beneficial uses. In addition, this process would only apply to ag-dominated water bodies, a full definition of which is included in the proposed amendments. But to paraphrase, these are water bodies that have a significant amount of their flow dependent on agricultural operations during the irrigation season. The reason this process is needed relates to the incorporation of the sources of drinking water policy into the basin plans, which essentially applied a blanket application of the immune beneficial use to surface and groundwaters throughout the region. The water quality objectives that are identified in the basin plans as being protective of the immune beneficial use are the Title 22 primary and secondary maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs. This means that ag-dominated surface water bodies like the one pictured here should meet drinking water standards that are typically required at the tap. This incorporation of the sources of drinking water policy has resulted in overly conservative restrictions on dischargers such as agricultural operators and publicly owned treatment works, and has limited water reuse and conservation practices. However, the sources of drinking water policy does contain exceptions. The one that is most relevant to this project is Exception 2B, which is an exception for water in system designed or modified for the primary purpose of conveying or holding agricultural drainage. If the exception is applied, dischargers must be monitored to assure compliance with all relevant water quality objectives. But to use an exception to de-designate the MUUs, our basin plans require a basin plan amendment. An example of a discharger who was affected by the incorporation of the sources of drinking water policy into the basin plan is the city of Live Oak. There are wastewater treatment plant effluent discharges in lateral 2, which is a constructed ag drain as seen in the pictures. The city was faced with millions of dollars in upgrade costs to meet the Title 22 drinking water standards in this drain in order to protect for the immune use that was designated through the incorporation of the sources of drinking water policy. The city of Live Oak became a case study for the Sacramento River Basin, and an amendment to the basin plan was adopted by the board in 2015 to apply Exception 2B to de-designate the immune use in this drain. But a typical individual basin plan amendment process, such as this one for the Live Oak, can easily take 3 to 5 years to complete. Based on information we have from historic work conducted in our region, we know that there are over 6,000 ag-dominated surface water bodies, many of which could potentially meet Exception 2B. So for this basin plan amendment project, we worked with a variety of stakeholders throughout the Central Valley to develop a standardized region-wide immune evaluation process that was streamlined and would shorten the time frame required to amend the basin plans. Here is a list of stakeholders staff regularly met with since 2012, including state and federal agencies and representatives from agriculture, water supply, and urban water users. Working with our stakeholders, our first step was to ask which type of water bodies fall under Exception 2B of the Sources of Drinking Water Policy. This led us to develop a water body categorization flowchart that was adapted from historic efforts to help categorize different types of ag-dominated water bodies. Next, the appropriate immune beneficial uses and associate water quality objectives were determined for each water body category. Through this process, we found that there were categories of ag-dominated water bodies that did not clearly meet the Exception 2B of the Sources of Drinking Water Policy, but nonetheless had inherent characteristics such as low flow or elevated constituent concentrations that limited their ability to serve as a immune source. This led to the development of a refined immune beneficial use called limited immune, or L-immune, which we discussed in detail at past meetings. Next, we work with stakeholders to develop implementation and monitoring surveillance provisions for the proposed immune evaluation process. Another way of looking at the proposed process is the following flowchart. This flowchart describes major steps that make up the implementation program. The implementation program starts with the immune evaluation process initiation and review step, wherein the applicant submits all necessary documents and staff reviews and verifies that information. This leads to the second step, where staff makes recommendation on the water body category, immune designation, and monitoring and surveillance program. The monitoring and surveillance program will be discussed in more detail in the next slides. Staff recommendations will undergo a public review process and require executive officer approval before being appended to the reference document. The reference document is a document that sits outside of the basin plans and can be used by the board to establish interim permit limits. In the last step, water bodies in the reference document will be bundled and considered periodically by the board for adoption into the basin plan, along with their appropriate immune designations. This region-wide process allows for a more timely application of appropriate permit limits and streamlines the basin plan amendment process. Throughout this process, there have been a lot of questions and comments on monitoring and surveillance, so I'd like to spend a few minutes discussing the key monitoring and surveillance provisions that are part of the proposed amendments. To use exception 2B in the sources of drinking water policy to de-designate the immune beneficial use, the policy requires monitoring to assure compliance with all relevant water quality objectives. Monitoring is also an important component of our regulatory programs to ensure that water quality is protected downstream of discharges consistent with the state anti-degradation policy. To fulfill these requirements, the monitoring review process that we are proposing as part of the overall implementation of these amendments will consider monitoring activities and water quality information within and downstream of each area under consideration. We found that the best way to provide this type of assessment was through the development of comprehensive monitoring guides, which were discussed at the February hearing. These guides include detailed monitoring information for Central Valley Water Board's regulatory programs as well as outside entities. These guides will be used by staff to assess existing monitoring coverage, water quality information, and identify potential data gaps within and downstream of an applicant's study area. With the use of the comprehensive monitoring guides, staff will conduct a case-by-case monitoring assessment for each application we receive in order to take interim monitoring recommendations to ensure that downstream water quality is protected. Staff may recommend that no additional monitoring is required or that additional monitoring is required to fill in data gaps. Water quality results for any existing or additional monitoring added as a condition of interim designations will be evaluated as part of the basin plan amendment process. Any new or existing water quality monitoring will remain in effect until data demonstrates no unreasonable impacts downstream. Dischargers are responsible to ensure that new discharges or changes in character, location, or volume of discharge do not result in unreasonable impact to water quality downstream. And as resources permit, the Central Valley Water Board staff will work with other agencies and regional monitoring programs to conduct Title 22 source water monitoring in key immune designated watersheds like the Sacramento, San Joaquin, and Feather Rivers every 3 to 5 years to support the 303D, 305B integrated report process, which is required by the Clean Water Act and identifies impaired water bodies, and the watershed sanitary surveys, which is the Title 22 requirement for water purveyors. We have just provided you with an overview of the proposed process. In addition to the initial case study that was conducted in the Sacramento River Basin, staff tested this process on a case study in the Sacramento River Basin, San Luis Canal Company. Using the water body categorization framework, we apply the process to 231 constructed or modified ag-dominated surface water bodies in their district and confirm the suitability of a region-wide process. As part of the proposed amendments, staff recommends to move the immune beneficial use from these water bodies, which meet exception 2B in the sources of drinking water policy. Ann Littlejohn will now focus discussion on public comments we received on the proposed amendments and the draft staff report.
Good afternoon, board members. My name is Ann Littlejohn, and I'm a senior environmental scientist here in the Rancho Cordova office, and I have taken the oath. During the February 23rd hearing, we received oral comments from both the public and the board members. Oral comments were received from 9 commenters. The majority of the oral comments were in support of the proposed Basin Plan amendment. There were a few issues noted from several stakeholders, and since these issues were also reflected in their written comments, I will address them shortly. The board did comment on a request from one of the stakeholders requesting input from the Division of Drinking Water, or DDW, and the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or OWEHA. The board agreed specifically in terms of obtaining feedback from DDW. Since the February hearing, staff did reach out to both DDW and OWEHA. The Division of Drinking Water provided a memo evaluating the proposed Basin Plan amendment and came to the conclusion that the amendments appropriately provide the needed level of protection. This memo is included in your agenda packet. Board staff also spoke with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, which raised no objections and deferred to DDW's judgment. The February board hearing was held during the public comment period, so next I'd like to discuss the written comments we received during this time frame. Staff received 12 letters during the public comment period that ended March 24th of this year. These letters are included in your agenda packet and came from a variety of stakeholders listed here in this slide. The response to comments document that's provided in your agenda packet contains over 500 comments. Since there are a number of sections in the response to comments document, I'd like to briefly just go over how the document was organized. The first section covers broad issues that were brought up by multiple commenters. The second section covers the oral comments that we received at the February board hearing. The third responds to written comments from comment letters, and Section 4 contains DDW's memo evaluating the proposed amendments. We also have a separate document as Appendix A of the response to comments that includes additional responses to over 500 inserted comments and proposed edits that were submitted by the Sacramento River Source Water Protection Program on the draft staff report. For today's presentation, I am only discussing the broad issues that came up from multiple commenters and comments that led to edits or revisions in the draft staff report or the proposed Basin Plan language. The broad issues are as follows. The first is regarding the adequacy of the proposed monitoring and surveillance program to protect downstream beneficial uses. The second pertains to cumulative impacts and long-term protection. The third is regarding the consistency of the proposed amendments with the sources of drinking water policy. And the fourth is regarding the application and protection of the limited immune beneficial use. The first broad issue was concern with the adequacy of the monitoring and surveillance program to monitor discharges and ensure that downstream water bodies providing the mune use are protected. Staff's response to this issue is that the proposed monitoring assessments and subsequent recommendations will be done on a case-by-case basis. As Cindy discussed earlier, staff will be using comprehensive monitoring guides for these assessments. These guides include detailed major basin planning or basin monitoring information for the Central Valley Water Board's monitoring programs as well as other entities, and will be updated and expanded every 3 to 5 years. Staff will also, at a minimum, review the 303D 305B integrated report and may also review other documents such as the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program's management plans, the NPDES self-monitoring reports, and DDW's watershed sanitary surveys to identify water quality constituents of concern and potential data gaps. These steps in the proposed process will enable staff to develop monitoring recommendations that ensure relevant water quality objectives are met and prevent unreasonable water quality impacts. In addition, as resources permit, the Central Valley Water Board staff will work with other entities to conduct Title 22 source water monitoring in key mune designated watersheds every 3 to 5 years to support future water quality assessments like the integrated report and the watershed sanitary surveys. The second broad issue was concern that the staff report does not provide a sufficient review of potential cumulative impacts to downstream mune water bodies to ensure their long-term protection. Staff responded to this issue by expanding the discussion on cumulative impacts in the draft staff report. Irrigated agriculture has existed for more than a century in the Central Valley. For the vast majority of that time, even after the sources of drinking water policy was incorporated into the basin plans, agricultural dischargers operated as if there was no expectation that their ag drains and supply channels would be relied on as a municipal and domestic water source. And although ag management practices have been improving water quality under the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, or ILRP, the board has granted enough flexibility under the ILRP for agricultural dischargers to prioritize their efforts. And current improvements have not been based solely on protecting the mune use in ag drains and supply channels. Therefore, removal or refinement of the mune beneficial use in these water bodies is not expected to result in any significant changes to water quality. With regard to the long-term protection of the mune water bodies after adoption of these amendments, the board will continue to implement the state anti-degradation policy when authorizing any discharge of waste in individual permits, as well as in general orders, including those required by the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. The third broad issue was concerned that the proposed process is not consistent with the sources of drinking water policy because first, the exception 2B is being applied to water bodies that carry a combination of agricultural drainage water and supply water. And second, that water bodies that do not meet the exceptions are designated with a limited mune beneficial use designation. Staff's response is that exception 2B applies to systems designed or modified for the primary purpose of conveying or holding agricultural drainage waters. Exception 2B does not require that only agricultural drainage be conveyed or held in these systems to meet the exception, but rather that the primary purpose of construction and or modification is to convey agricultural drainage. The limited mune designation, on the other hand, does not remove the mune use, but instead recognizes the limited potential of the water body as a mune source due to limiting inherent characteristics. The limited mean beneficial use is consistent with the sources of drinking water policy because the board will continue to protect these limited but potentially suitable mune sources rather than removing the mune beneficial use designation. The fourth broad issue was concerned with the application and proposed water quality objective for the limited mune beneficial use. Specifically, there's concern that the limited mune definition is too vague and that its narrative water quality objective is not protective of the water body and downstream beneficial uses. Staff's response clarifies that the limited mune beneficial use applies to water bodies that do not meet exceptions in the sources of drinking water policy and may only provide limited potential as a source of mune due to inherent characteristics such as intermittent flows and/or natural elevated background constituent concentrations. The water quality objective for limited mune emphasizes that the water quality and downstream beneficial uses must be protected consistent with the state anti-degradation policy. This consistency requires the board to make specific findings before allowing any degradation. When issuing permits for discharges into limited mune water bodies that are considered high-quality waters, the board will be required to consider whether dischargers have implemented best practical treatment or control, as well as whether degradation will be consistent with the maximum benefit of the people of the state. In addition to the four broad issues, there was a general comment regarding the rationale for no scientific peer review and the importance of obtaining peer review, including input from the Division of Drinking Water and the Office of Environmental and Health Hazard Assessment. Staff's response is that an independent scientific peer review is not required for these amendments because the proposed evaluation process, along with the establishment of the limited mune beneficial use, do not rely upon any empirical data, scientific findings, conclusions, or assumptions to establish a new regulatory level, standard, or other requirement as stipulated by the Health and Safety Code. The process instead relies upon policy determinations, existing water quality and monitoring information and language from the sources of drinking water policy and the state anti-degradation policy. The request of peer review that includes DDW and OEHA is a consultation rather than an independent scientific peer review requirement of the Health and Safety Code. As mentioned earlier, staff reached out to these agencies to solicit feedback on the amendments, and a memo was received by DDW concluding that the proposed amendments were appropriately protective of existing and potential mune. Next, I will discuss a few comments that led to changes in the staff report. The first comment recommended amending the definition of ag drainage to be consistent with the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program by including water leaving agricultural fields not only from irrigation practices, but also from precipitation. Staff agreed that related programs should be consistent, and the definition of ag drainage was revised to water leaving an agricultural field either from irrigation practices or precipitation. However, to ensure that there is also consistency with exception 2B in the sources of drinking water policy, which is intended for water bodies that have been designed or modified for the primary purpose of holding and conveying ag drainage, staff added primary purpose as clarification to the water body categorization flowchart. The second comment that led to a change in the staff report was in response to US EPA's comment that the staff report did not include a use and value determination. US EPA's use and value determination applies to water bodies that fall under federal jurisdiction. Through the proposed mune evaluation process, whether or not a water body falls under federal jurisdiction, the considerations made by the board largely satisfy the requirements of a use and value determination. overlap of state regulations for establishing beneficial uses and objectives, and federal regulations that are part of a use and value determination, includes considerations of hydraulic characteristics of the water bodies and potential impacts to beneficial uses. Clarification of this issue was added to the draft staff report in the laws, regulation, and policy section, as well as the beneficial uses section. The last comment that led to a change in the staff report related to concern that the economic evaluation lacked consideration and analysis of drinking water treatment and residual management costs for downstream utilities. Staff's response was to add a new section in Chapter 13 to discuss potential impacts to utilities and service systems. The environmental checklist was also revised to acknowledge that while water purveyors may incur additional monitoring and treatment costs, these costs are not expected to be significant because, as described earlier, current practices are not anticipated to change significantly. When permits are being considered by the board, potential economic impacts would be included as part of an anti-degradation analysis. And should the permit authorize the degradation of any high-quality waters, and must be consistent with the maximum benefit to the people of the state. Included in your agenda packet are strike-through and clean versions of the draft staff report. These have been made available to the public, and as discussed in the previous slides, clarifications were made to the staff report and minor revisions were made to the proposed basin plan language. Late revisions were also made based on follow-up meetings, and these include changes to the staff report, the proposed basin plan language, and the resolution. The changes to the basin plan language include excuse me. Sorry, fighting off a cold. Include clarifications in the categorization flowchart and the monitoring and surveillance chapter. The late revisions to the staff report are primarily edits to ensure consistency of language throughout the document or provide additional clarification. The late revisions to the resolution include a few minor clarifications and also a new resolution finding which states that the board may develop additional guidance as needed for implementing the region-wide muni evaluation process during future amendments or reviews of the basin plans. This slide shows our next steps and timeline. Today, the board will consider adopting this basin plan amendment. If it is adopted today, we would anticipate a state board hearing by the end of this year, followed by the Office of Administrative Law and U.S. EPA approval by mid-2018. At this time, I would like to ask the board to include the staff presentation into the record and adopt the resolution that approves the staff report and its supporting environmental documentation, along with the revisions, and adopts this basin plan amendment into both basin plans. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much. The two of you addressed a very complex item. I don't think I have ever seen that many different items that had to be replied to in the discussion of letters and comments coming in. And I think you did a great job of taking something that was complex and getting it down to the point where it was understandable. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, I'm good for one.
Sure,
Excuse me.
go ahead.
If you got a drain that goes between two landowners, and who's responsible as we find these smaller and smaller waterways?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Ugh. Responsible for what? I'm sorry.
Danny, you can repeat the question. She was in the midst of a cough.
Sorry.
I just envision we're now dealing with a lot of these smaller ag drains, very small waterways, and I know a lot of them are probably right down the property line between two landowners. You know, how do we handle that when there's a problem with that particular waterway?
So, if I could, I think the answer is actually this board will look at who's ever discharging into that waterway to find the solution. So it's less water body specific than it is searching for the discharge. And in terms of how this basin plan amendment is structured, if somebody wants to change that use designation for that water body, chances are it'll be the person discharging into that water body that will be putting the package together for staff's review. And obviously it would involve both landowners when we're going to go through the process to evaluate whether the beneficial uses in that water body should be changed or not.
So it has to do more with the origin of the.
Yeah, exactly. This board in general is very focused on the discharges and regulating the discharges, and that's the perspective that this basin plan amendment takes.
Any further questions, comments? Thank you very much. We'll next go to interested persons. You know, I have a card here, but I think it's from Bob Gore, and I think you put the wrong number on it. So if Bob Gore's here, but he's not here.
He's not commenting on this item.
So we will move on. Patrick Lewis. And following Patrick, we'll have Randy Reck.
Good afternoon, Dr. Longley, board members. My name is Patrick Lewis. I'm an attorney with O'Laughlin in Paris, and I'm here representing the San Joaquin Tributaries Authority. I've taken the oath from Sacramento. The SJTA and its members would like to thank the Central Valley Water Quality Control Board and staff for addressing the inappropriate blanket application of the municipal and domestic beneficial use to agriculturally dominated water bodies in the Central Valley region. We support the amendment, yet we have one concern regarding one of the changes to the final staff draft report. We are concerned with the categorization of C1 for constructed ag drainage combo and the addition of the phrase primary purpose. We're not opposed to the addition of the language. We're just concerned that primary purpose is not defined in the sources of drinking water policy or the staff report. As it is not defined, and as many times is the case, this term could be interpreted highly subjectively. For this reason, we feel that in the future it may lead to confusion when determining water body categorization, or in the future if the de-designation of a water body is challenged. Many of these water bodies that are going to be considered for the de-designation or the limited beneficial use serve intermittently as both drainage and supply in various reaches of the same water body system. Moreover, they can alter quite a bit depending on the hydrological year or the events that are happening seasonally. For this reason, we ask that in analyzing and determining the primary purpose of a water body that the regional board or staff give deference to the owner-operator stakeholder determination of primary purpose. Unless red flags or a site visit would, basically lead the board to not give deference to one of these owner-operators. Owner-operator stakeholders are the individuals with the most knowledge concerning these water bodies and how they're operated, especially when they're operated intermittently. For this reason, we request that deference be given to their categorization when determining these permits. Thank you.
It strikes me that, in fact, that word could be, rather than primary purpose, could be primary purposes with purpose with an S in parens. Because as you point out, I can think of actually 3 different uses possibly for them. But That does raise an interesting question, which will go to council. John, you had a,
Well, yes, hi. You said your request is provide deference. So are you not asking for any change in the language?
We're not opposed to the language or the inclusion of primary purpose Figure Y specifically. And additionally, in the late change revisions, there was an additional section that was added to staff's review of these permits, and that was also to consider the primary purpose. We would like it to be on the record that you'll give deference to the owner-operators if you don't feel that, that changes are necessarily needed at this time. If you were inclined to do so, we feel that potentially under the regional board review section, where the primary purpose is going to be considered, footnote could be added saying that deference will be given to owner-operators. But as I previously mentioned, as it is currently written, we are not opposed to the language.
So, and I'll speak before council, if that's
go
okay.
ahead, John.
It seems to me the administrative record here is pretty clear what the purpose of this whole process is, and I, for one, would be concerned with providing deference to the regulated party, just especially if we hardwire that in somehow. So I'll, with that said, I'll go to council, but I think the administrative record is pretty robust, what we're trying to do here, and that's where you would probably defer to first. But with that said.
Before you defer to council, can I address your question,
Yeah,
Board Member
absolutely. Sure.
Constantino?
Yeah.
Within the regulations, you are sending out staff members, having boots on the ground to look at all these systems. Obviously, you're not going to be able to do that with all of these permits as, the systems are numerous. But, if there are red flags or conditions that would lead you to otherwise not provide deference to an owner-operator, that, in our opinion, is absolutely just fine. In those instances, deference shouldn't be given to the owner-operator if there's red flags, and an inspection should be done to follow up on this primary purpose.
Yeah, and I would say that the owner-operator should certainly have a stake in this and figuring out what they think the water body is or isn't. I just don't know that I want to hardwire in the word deference to the Jeannie. You're either waving me off or you're.
No, I'm not waving you off. I want to provide some clarity to the process because we explained it in detail, and I'm not sure if you were at the original hearing. The way the process is the owner-operator of the system has to be party to the characterization report that comes in. So in doing that, it's the report that provides the initial identification of the characteristics of the water body and the category of the water body. So whether or not the primary purpose is conveying and holding agricultural drainage. So we are providing deference in that piece, in that we are utilizing that report from the owner and operator. The boots on the ground that you were talking about is our verification process, and we have identified in the staff report something that we did back in 1991, and we found it was very effective, is that for any natural ag-dominated water body that's been identified, we will review and we will use boots on the ground and do a visual survey and review the records of what's going on with that water body. And while we are in those systems, we will look at approximately 10% of the other identified water bodies just to determine consistency. As he noted, we have over 6,000 water bodies. We're not going to commit to looking at every single one of those, but we feel that by using the owner-operator's judgment initially and then going out and verifying it, we are providing an appropriate amount of deference to their understanding of their own system and how it's being managed, but we are verifying that. That's just what I wanted to say.
Yeah, and to be frank, I think Jeannie took most of the words out of my mouth. And I think we struggled with this, and we struggled with this with every basin plan amendment or regulatory document that we work through. first of all, the primary purpose does come from the source of drinking water policy, so that's why it was incorporated in there to essentially strengthen the legal integrity of the documents that you have in front of you. And I totally concur with Jeannie that we're really putting it on the owner-operators to put that package together for the board's consideration, for board staff to review. So there is a little bit of deference built into that process. I certainly see Mr. Lewis's concern of if board staff start vetoing this with regularity. I mean, that's the concern that everybody is looking out for, and that has pretty big consequences. And what we're actually proposing with some of the late revisions is to incorporate a finding in the resolution that if we need such guidance for a variety of issues, including perhaps guidance specific to primary purpose, if this issue starts to arise, we revisit that issue and perhaps generate a guidance document to really constrain either board staff's opinion of what primary purpose is, if the owner-operators are repeatedly coming into problems there. And so that's kind of how we're addressing it, because frankly, we have run through the case studies, and thus far, it does appear that the primary purpose isn't a tripping point. With the information that comes into the board, it's relatively black and white, and at least in terms of the issues that the board sees. So we didn't see that as a stumbling block. Perhaps if we hadn't done any case studies and characterized very, very many water bodies thus far, we would be looking into that issue in greater depth. But as of right now, we have run through a lot of case studies. Primary purpose isn't a major tripping point. If it does become one in the future, what we're proposing is that the board incorporate in their resolution the commitment to come back and develop guidance as to that issue. And I don't know if that answers your question fully. Perhaps we can't provide that level of certainty here, but that's our proposed way of dealing with issues like the primary purpose issue.
I definitely understand where you're coming from. Just to add an additional wrinkle as part of our concern is that not only could there be ambiguity based on staff's review, but as these are added into the basin plan and the basin plans are considered, it could be a point where someone else would be able to challenge the findings of the board in order to hold up the basin plan or these de-designations.
Certainly, and to be frank, I mean, I think we're here today to try and streamline that process, and if it does need additional streamlining, and I think, if we're advocating for a refinement or a change to a beneficial use, and we see that primary purpose, and the board sees that primary purpose is a tripping block and is something that the ambiguity is creating problems, I think we do have generally a commitment from the board to make this happen. We need to get a document out there, if not an amendment to this basin plan, to make it even a smoother process. But thank you for your position.
No, thank you. The SJTA appreciates your time.
Thank you. Randy Reck. And then Debbie Wester. We have a card for Debbie this time.
Good afternoon. My name is Randy Reck. I'm an attorney with the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water. I have taken the oath, and I'm from Sacramento. I'm here representing not only my organization, EJCW, but also San Francisco Baykeeper and the Pesticide Action Network. We submitted comments back in March that we collectively signed on to. I do have quite a few comments to run through here. I'll do my best to do it in 3 minutes. I should say first that we represent a coalition of environmental justice, environmental and public health groups who represent thousands within the Central Valley area. Unfortunately, the minor changes made to the amendment between our last comments in March and this final version do not address some of the concerns that we first raised then in March. First, we think that this policy does not protect downstream drinking water users, and for a few reasons. One, that monitoring is undefined and insufficient to show no harm to these downstream users. The staff analysis acknowledges that there may be impacts to the downstream water users, as we just heard, but that these impacts are less than significant, but that analysis is very weak in our opinion. I should just mention that upgrades to drinking water plants, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, are very costly and take time. And we think that this proposal quite literally passes the bill and the public health risks down to these, the other drinking water plants and other downstream users. Moving on, we also take issue with the definition of agriculture-dominated waters. We don't think that it meets the limited exception of 2B from the state drinking water policy. And while we do appreciate the addition of the primary purpose language in the late revisions, we think that this term and even the term modified is significantly ambiguous and allows discharges not only from water bodies that convey agricultural water and drainage water, but also natural water bodies that could be dominated by agricultural operations. This seems to be in contradiction to the state drinking water policy and beyond the intent of those original words as they were drafted. The limited municipal designation is municipal in name only. It does not protect a water body in any way for municipal users. This new designation erases all the protections that the state drinking water policy brought to bear. And it goes beyond this by removing protections for all pollutants, not just pollutants that have elevated natural background levels. We think this is in violation of, or this will allow dischargers to not comply with MCLs and the CTR policy, and violates this, the drinking water policy. And let me just finish up by saying that we think this amendment also will allow the further degradation of high-quality waters in violation of both the state and federal anti-degradation policies. Thank you.
We don't operate that way, Bill, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You're ready to wrap up?
Yes, I am wrapping up there, but thank you for the opportunity to present here today.
Any questions? Thank you very much. Debbie Webster, and then I have Debbie Liebersbach.
Thank you, Chair Longley and board members. Debbie Webster, Executive Officer of the Central Valley Clean Water Association. And I want to first commend staff and you as, again, this is one of those stakeholder processes which we spend a lot of time trying to deal with a big issue in a very streamlined but appropriately protective way. And I think that this is a very important step when the sources of drinking water was recently interpreted through our NPDES permits as blanketing the MUN process, the de-designation, and as was mentioned, the process to go through and do something that was not intended where those exceptions already existed in that policy was big. And I think that this, as we're looking at what's coming forward through the state board and other things, the appropriate designation, something that's going to appropriately protect those beneficial uses but not be overly protective and not disincentivize things like use of recycled water for agricultural facility, for agriculture or other things. This is the right answer, and it's a good process. It has the amount of checks and balances, but it was also done through a collaborative process, which makes it important. I do want to say I disagree, and I respectively disagree a little bit with the last comment. Is you as a regional board in the state have an important tool in the anti-degradation policy. And the anti-degradation policy is not something that says, hey, you can just let everything go to hell in the handbasket and it doesn't really matter. What it is that you're maintaining it to the highest degree that's reasonable and looking at these different factors, and you don't give away anything unless there's a reason for it. And there's public reasons that have been identified through our state laws that are good reasons to allow some degradation. However, this policy doesn't just give it away, and I really want to emphasize that. That was an important part. It's an important part when it's limited or may happen in the future, but we're not sure. We talked a lot about it, and I think the proposed amendment goes towards that. So I just want to, again, thank you, and we just let you know we support this.
Thank you, Debbie. Questions? Thank you very much. Debbie, you indicated you, good, you do. Okay, next is Bill Elliot.
Good afternoon. I'm Debbie Liebersbach with the Turlock Irrigation District, and I did take the oath. I just wanted to reemphasize the importance of this effort and to express our appreciation to the staff and the board for taking on this effort and the collaborative process that was undertaken in kind of working through all of the issues to try to come to a point that we are today. I also wanted to re-emphasize the concept that if these water bodies were to be changed for their designation for to either not MUN or a limited MUN, that's not going to change what's actually happening within the systems now. I mean, these are agriculturally dominated water bodies and used for a specific purpose. And so from a water agency perspective, there isn't an intention to, change what we're doing, with one exception perhaps, and that's for us, we're looking at making use of recycled water in our agricultural facilities. And this might enable us to do that in a way that's still protective of the agricultural uses, yet wouldn't necessarily require significant additional treatment of the wastewater, the tertiary treated wastewater that we would be using. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions? Okay, Bill? And then David Corey.
Bill Alio, I'm with the Environmental Working Group. I should have put on my speaker card. I'm here representing San Francisco Baykeeper, who authorized me to appear before them. They're one of the 4 signees that the prior speaker spoke for. So I won't go back over what he covered. I just want to make a few points, is that obviously staff is dealing with a huge problem that took a long stakeholder thing and not a million acres, but thousands of farmers and thousands of acres. So it's very difficult. But like just the anti-degradation policy, that part of the reason you justify this, we think is weak. We pointed this out before on other things, that saying there's an overall benefit to the people of state is, I think, stretching it. And I could talk about almonds that are 60% of them are exported, and rice, a huge percentage of that. So all the runoff coming from rice fields, does that really benefit the state, that we look the other way a little bit and say they can pollute up to a certain amount as long as it's not fouling the anti-degradation policy? On those small amounts, when I moved to Sacramento in the late 1980s, the water had a funny taste sometimes, and they finally figured it out. It was an herbicide that the rice growers were using, and the fix was to let it sit in the fields longer and degrade or break down before they open the little gates and let it out into these agricultural dominated bodies, which reached the Sacramento, which reached my tap water in Sacramento, and the taste went away. So what I was drinking instead of noticing it were parts per billion of a broken down herbicide. I don't think that's good. And in my work with environmental health, I'll give you a little factoid about, do parts per billion matter? Drugs people use like albuterol for asthma works therapeutically at 2 parts per billion. Cialis, which most of us know about now because of TV ads, works at 30 parts per billion. Paxil, an antidepressant, birth controls work at parts per billion. So if I'm drinking parts per billion of pesticides and herbicides, as we kind of loosen up the standards, because it's very difficult to put our arms around regulating all these thousands of ditches, and the farmers who complain they're farmers, not bureaucrats, and believe me, I don't want to run a farm, I know it's tough. But that's what we're leading down here. Instead of getting tougher, it seems to me the overall impact, and the comments submitted by San Francisco Baykeeper emphasize why in detail through about 7 or 8 reasons we oppose this order. Thank you. The Basin Plan Amendment. Thanks.
Questions? Thank you, Bill. David Corey.
Chair Longley, members of the board, David Corey, representing the San Joaquin Valley Drainage Authority West Side Coalition. I was here back in the Live Oak hearing when this first issue came up in front of Live Oak and looking at the POTWs and small disadvantaged communities having to spend millions of dollars to meet a drinking water standard in a roadside ditch. It was ludicrous. And everybody on the board knew that. There was nobody advocating for it other than the attorney. It wasn't Patrick at the time, as I recall, but pointing out that you're legally obligated to impose these restrictions because of the sources of drinking water policy. When I looked at that, sitting here thinking with my ag hat, I said, wow, this is a real problem for ag. Especially on the west side where you've got really high salts and those sorts of things, but all over the valley. If the board was going to regulate and enforce us to meet drinking water standards in every ag drainage, we can't do that. I mean, it's just impossible. And it was sort of one of the things I often point out is that we shouldn't be obligated to do stupid things with no benefits. And I think this is an amendment that avoids us doing that, to do reasonable protections. I think one of the issues, and you look at the rice pesticide program and look at what Bill discussed in terms of the issues with the West Sacramento's drinking water. That history of the rice pesticide program basically shows that we can protect drinking water sources and not have to move up and impose drinking water standards in the ag drains. We can look to where we need to protect the use. We don't have to do it in every ag drain that's this wide. And that's what the current policy does. So we need to have some policy, and I think we've done that in this Basin Plan Amendment. And I think, rice pesticide program is a good example of how we achieve actual protection of uses and not force growers and society, POTWs, disadvantaged communities, to do stupid things for no benefit. So anyway, thank you, staff, for putting this together. I appreciate it.
Any questions for David?
I just, I think Bill's point too was, the chlorobin, the herbicide they were using in the rice that caused odor problems in Sacramento and West Sacramento in particular, breaks down. But he also reiterated the importance of looking at constituencies in terms of parts per billion. And while it breaks down, we may not know the impacts of over time that all of us are getting in these parts per billion. So I think that's the corollary to what Bill said, and I think we all need to keep that in mind on an ongoing basis, because there is more and more chemicals going around in our environment at this point in time, and we've played whack-a-mole quite a bit. But it's a concern not just for the environmental community, but for all of us that live in the Central Valley in particular. So,
right, and I think that gets to what's the appropriate objective in the appropriate place. And so I support that, protecting drinking water sources where they are applied. But again, we're not changing the status quo with this change. What we're doing is preventing impositions of regulations that actually have no benefit in a place where there is no drinking water. No one's going to stick a straw in a roadside ditch and start drinking it, and I don't think we propose that we should.
I might be a little more sensitive now that I'm drinking Sacramento River water.
Well, I drink it as well, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who wishes to testify on this matter? Seeing none, then we will go to closing statement by staff.
Actually, I didn't have one prepared, and I should tell you who I am. I'm Jean Chilk. Oh, good, you know.
We all know you, Jeannie.
That's a little scary, actually. I just want to say that I'm very happy that we're here today, and we're actually moving forward on this amendment. I started this process in 1991, I hate to say, and the board did move forward on it in 1992, and it was sidetracked for several years. I understand the concern that we're hearing with the stakeholders. I'm very happy that this was a very thorough stakeholder process. We had quite a few people at the table. I commend my staff for being actively engaged in the process, really listening to people, trying to do the revisions, trying to really come to as much of a consensus as possible. As you can see with the late revisions, they worked right up until yesterday. you know, trying to really make sure that they were addressing as many of the concerns as possible, and coming to as full a consensus as we could. I do think this is a very logical amendment. I think it does provide a transparent and streamlined and consistent process of moving forward with exceptions that were already recognized in the sources of drinking water policy. And I am hoping that the board agrees. And that's my comments.
Thank you. Recommendation by the executive officer?
Thank you, Dr. Longley. As I agree with all that Jeannie said, and I support this amendment as well for the board. I would like to point out that we are finally moving forward on doing some CEC monitoring, constituents of emerging concern in surface water. So that's another item we'll have to bring for the board to update you. That's been a long time coming, and we finally have the state board on board for us. So some of those issues raised by Bill will be addressed through that program. And also, I should point out, under another hat of Jeannie's is the pesticide control programs that we continue to implement, and that'll address some of these other concerns. So with that, I think this, considering where we were back with Live Oak and you pointing your fingers at us, telling us to fix it, to where we are today, I really am appreciative of the effort staff put in and the time it took for them to do this. I think it's a great Basin Plan amendment, and I recommend that we approve it.
Thank you very much.
And if I could, I would just add, for the record, there were a number of concerns raised by the environmental justice groups. I do believe that all of those issues have been addressed in the response to comments in the staff report, and that the proposed Basin Plan amendment is fully consistent with all applicable laws, regulations, and policies.
Thank you. And before we shut down, just to follow on what Bob was saying, and Pamela also, you know, Bill did bring up an important topic, and that, of course, was the fact that when these things are diluted out, get to the point where they decay somewhat, they're still there often in concentrations we can't measure. But there also we have the issue of, particularly under UV, under sunlight, some of them are changed to other products that various chemical moieties that may or may not have a health impact. This is what I think is so very important for the for the toxicological monitoring that we have, in that we literally can't go out and measure each and every item out there in the environment. But the toxicological work, while it's not perfect, it doesn't get everything. It's a much broader screen, but it's expensive. And we heard earlier today, how do you interpret it? That some of those tests are very difficult to interpret. So, Dan, you keep talking about the need for university research, and certainly one big area where we need a lot of work is in the biological monitoring, using the various receptors that are used to, and maybe they're the wrong ones, but there needs to be a lot of work done in that area to make it more sensitive and more reliable, simply because that's where we get where we'll get the hits, where things that we're not measuring chemically. So, with that said, at this point we'll leave we'll close the hearing and leave deliberation and voting to the board. Any thoughts, questions, ideas, or do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion in a minute. The only thing I want to say is I want to thank the board, the board staff and management. This has come before us 3-4 times, I think, right? So this was one where it is complicated, but I've seen Ann speak several times, and I didn't feel I needed a briefing today before today, because I thought we were brought along for the ride, and I appreciate that. That was quite a trip, and I'll move.
Well, John, before you move, when she started talking about 1991, 92, it occurred to me, and I was here then, that I was about your age then. And that scared the hell out of me, so you can go ahead and make your motion.
I move that I'm not here when, no. I move that we adopt with late revisions.
I'll second.
John's moved, Dan seconded. Any further deliberation?
Excuse me.
Call the roll.
I just wanted to say that I appreciated, in this case particularly, Pamela's summation that went back to a little of the history of how we got here and how we got here, and I think that's important in this case.
It was important.
And I, as always, thank the staff, and I really like the stakeholder process and how we have the parties engaged and participating at the table. So when you do come up with the decisions that are made, it's not something that the staff has come up with on their own. They've worked with the parties involved, and it makes a difference. Everyone is not happy with what's done, but in the process, it's been a full process where everyone was engaged and was privy to be at the table and a part of the decision and final outcome. Commend the staff, and I'm in support of this.
And Jeannie, thank you for your perseverance over all those years. Okay, call the roll, please.
Mr. Costantino?
Aye.
Dr. Markham?
Aye.
Mr. Schneider? Ms. Brower?
Yes.
Ms. Kadara? Dr. Longley?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you very much. Good work. Thank you, staff. Points were brought up by folks in the audience that we really need to take to heart and think about as we go down the road with this. With that said, I think we're a big step forward. We're going to take a short break. Please be back in here 20 after 3. Excuse me, we're a little slow today. I think we're getting a little tired is what is happening. And we are back in session. And this is agenda item 12, status update on pasture poultry operations under the Poultry General Order. This time the board will hear a status update on poultry pasture. I'm getting tongue-tied on this thing. Say it real fast. Pasture poultry operations under the Poultry General Order. This is an information item only, and no action will be taken, although the board may ask questions and provide direction to staff. After the staff presentation, interested persons will be allowed 3 minutes each to address the board. We'll now hear the staff presentation. Doug, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good morning, or good afternoon, Chair Longley, members of the board. My name is Doug Pattison, and I'm a supervising engineer in the Fresno office and also the region's Confined Animal Facilities Program Manager. I'm here today to give you an update on pasture poultry operations as they relate to the recently adopted Poultry General Order. I will also be discussing an issue that recently came up regarding groundwater monitoring at small full coverage poultry operations. As you mentioned, this is an informational item, so no board action will be taken, but staff would appreciate any feedback or direction from the board. As you may recall, the Poultry General Order was adopted at the December 2016 board meeting and includes 2 tiers: a low threat tier for operations where the birds are housed indoors and manure is collected and exported off-site, and a full coverage tier for operations where birds spend a significant time outdoors, where manure is not exported off-site, or where there is a discharge of wastewater to land. For the low threat tier, the order requires submittal of an operation and maintenance plan that describes such things as the process for handling or exporting manure and the process for handling mortalities. And the order also requires submittal of an annual report. For the full coverage tier, the order has requirements in addition to the operation and maintenance plan and annual report. It requires a waste management plan, which is an engineering evaluation to demonstrate that the facility has the capacity to contain all wastewater generated at the facility. It requires a nutrient management plan for those facilities that apply animal waste to cropland, and it requires groundwater monitoring, either individually or as part of a representative monitoring program. At the December hearing for the Poultry General Order, there was testimony questioning whether all the requirements for full coverage operations were necessary when birds are raised in pastures with relatively low population densities. After considering the testimony, the board adopted the proposed Poultry General Order, but asked staff to return in August with a discussion about whether the order should be revised in consideration of pasture poultry operations. Pasture poultry operations are where birds are raised either for meat or for eggs in vegetated pastures rather than indoor housing. The birds eat bugs and vegetation in the pasture, supplemented by feed. The birds spend the majority of time foraging outdoors and sleep in a coop at night. The coop is either moved periodically around different parts of the pasture, or pastures are fenced and divided such that the birds have access to different areas every few days. It is critical that the pastures are vegetated and a healthy cover crop is maintained. After receiving information from pasture poultry operators, poultry industry representatives, and researchers at UC Davis, staff believes that if properly designed and operated, a pasture poultry operation poses a lower threat to water quality than conventional full coverage operations and could potentially qualify for low threat tier coverage under the Poultry General Order. In order to be considered low threat, pasture poultry operations would need to meet criteria to ensure constituents in manure do not impact either surface water or groundwater. Here's what we are thinking about as potential factors for determining whether a pasture operation is low threat. The first is population density. There should be a limit on the number of birds per unit area of pasture. The Poultry General Order currently includes a criterion of 1 animal unit per acre and a half of pasture. And if you recall, an animal unit is 1,000 pounds of animal and is a way of comparing apples to apples when considering different species or growth stages of animals. The criterion of 1 animal unit per 1.5 acres equates to about 285 laying hens per acre. The next criteria would be for the area where the birds are raised. It needs to be vegetated and maintained to ensure that a healthy pasture exists without large patches of bare ground. The next criterion would be for a minimum width of vegetated buffer or filter strips surrounding the pastures and on-site wells to prevent stormwater runoff from flushing contaminants to surface or groundwater. Another criterion would be that manure does not accumulate in any one area of a pasture. This can be prevented by frequently moving the coop or by designing the coop to contain manure generated within and periodically collecting it for export or, if appropriate, for on-site land application. And finally, there should be an operation and maintenance plan describing the management practices that each pasture operation will implement and annual reports documenting the low threat status of the facility. The second issue I would like to bring up are small poultry facilities in general, not just the pasture operations. During a recent stakeholder meeting, an industry representative indicated that the cost of compliance with the Poultry General Order was burdensome to the point that some small egg-laying facilities were considering closure. Egg-laying facilities typically generate a wastewater stream to wash and process the eggs. By discharging this liquid waste to land, they are not eligible for general coverage under the low threat tier. Because the wastewater from egg-laying facilities can contain waste constituents from manure washed off the eggs and from broken egg residue, groundwater monitoring is required. The facilities can conduct individual groundwater monitoring or join a representative monitoring program, and based on the monitoring results, they must then conduct an evaluation of management practices to document whether current practices are protective of water quality. If some management practices are not protective, the order requires that recommendations and a time schedule for upgrades or improvements be made. A representative monitoring program for poultry facilities has not been formed, and some smaller facilities may have trouble paying for installation and sampling of individual groundwater monitoring wells. Some of the larger egg processing facilities have the resources to conduct their own groundwater monitoring and may choose to go that route. This being the case, the task of forming and financially supporting a representative monitoring program may fall on the smaller dischargers. Smaller full coverage facilities may need more time to form and seek funding for a representative monitoring program or to install individual groundwater monitoring systems. Staff has spoken with representatives from both the Natural Resource Conservation Service and California Department of Food and Agriculture, and each have programs that could potentially help support a representative monitoring program. The sizes of egg-laying facilities subject to the Poultry General Order ranges from about 285 hens at the small end to more than 500,000 hens at the large end. Clearly, the facilities at the lower end of this scale produce less waste and therefore pose a lower threat to water quality than the larger facilities. The smaller facilities are also not as economically able to pay for installing monitoring wells or funding a representative monitoring program. Staff has identified potential actions the board could consider regarding these two issues. One would be to create criteria by which certain pasture poultry operations could qualify for low threat tier coverage. Another would be to extend the timeline for a subset of small full coverage tier facilities to form and implement a representative monitoring program or to install individual groundwater monitoring wells. To implement these actions, staff would work with UC Davis, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the Department of Food and Agriculture to determine appropriate criteria for pasture poultry operations and an appropriate time schedule for small full coverage operations, which would then be vetted through industry and environmental stakeholders. Through that process, other alternatives could be identified that the board might consider, and of course the board could choose to take no action on either or both of these issues. If revisions to the poultry general order are proposed, a tentative order could be circulated for public comment and placed on the agenda for the board's first meeting in 2018. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
So how many facilities are we talking about with the small facilities?
Well, it depends on where we draw that bar, that threshold of, but 100 or so would be my estimate. Maybe more than 100, fewer than 200.
Right.
And that's based on size?
Correct.
And what about number of pasture operations?
Handful. There's, I don't know that we've actually identified all of them, but it's maybe half a dozen, I believe. There's several. It's a lot more common along the coast, but we do have a few in our region.
So we're talking about, compared to some of the other kinds of livestock operations we're dealing with, we're really talking about small threat, aren't we?
I think, relatively speaking, yes.
So I would be, as one board member, I would be interested in, as you suggested, working with UC Davis and other agencies that might be able to help us put together a program that's not going to be terribly oppressive on these folks, and at the same time provide us the kind of information that we need to assess them.
Mm-hmm.
What I think would be a right program for them, though, they would probably think requires too much reporting. I think along that line, if they can simplified forms and reporting electronically should be part of it.
Yeah, if they were to qualify for the low threat tier, they just need to have an operation and maintenance plan, which frankly I think they should have anyway. It's not required that they submit that to us, just have it on site, and then submit an annual report once a year.
It strikes me, though, the operation and maintenance plan is something that UC Extension or some other entity, educational entity, could help them with.
Mm-hmm. And I think they'd be interested in doing that too.
Dan, is that something that UC Extension does?
Yeah, I think it's not unlike the nutrient management plans. I think these plans help these folks be better managers. My question is, how's this going to dovetail with the irrigated lands program on the low impact? Is that
right? Because irrigated pastures, some irrigated pasture is covered by the irrigated lands program. Because these pasture poultry operations would be covered under the poultry general order, even as low threat tier coverage facilities, then they would not need to get coverage under the irrigated lands regulatory program. But the poultry order does include many of the same requirements or requirements that are meant to address the same concerns as irrigated ag.
I have to think think like a farmer, they might think the other way, is they're on the irrigated lands, and this would be a subunit of their
Right.
irrigated lands, and therefore irrigated lands would handle some of the,
We-
off-site sampling and such.
That was a conversation we had when we wrote the order, yes.
And Dr. Markham, this is Clay Rogers. Part of the reason we don't typically cover animal facilities under the irrigated lands program is because it really doesn't consider the manure issues that we have to deal with, the runoff issues that we have with confined animal facilities. So that's the primary reason why it basically falls to the confined animal programs. Now, that being said, what we've done, we've tried to work to ensure that, dischargers don't end up getting caught under both orders, and that we have comprehensive orders that address the irrigated lands issues and the nutrient management planning when there's land application, and address the confined animal issues, but then not have to have coverage, pay double fees, double reporting for multiple programs.
Good, thanks.
But we do offer them to get into a regional plan, and that plan could be the dairies, it could be regular agriculture. We're not limiting their options to go outside the box to partner with people for monitoring.
So I guess I would concur with most of what Carl said. And, we just adopted this order, and if it can be refined for small and specialized operations, I think I'm for that. You mentioned January, right after the first year. That's too quick, as long as people aren't caught in some sort of timing limbo. I don't know that, I'd much rather have it, give you a little time to do it than to rush into something in the fall over the holidays, but,
Thank you.
yeah, thanks.
Right, and we're not really certain yet what the right number is, what the right density really should be, so give us time to hone that in.
I haven't seen any notices, but I assume you're having stakeholder meetings on this as well?
Sure, yes, we will.
Well, you've had stakeholder meetings, haven't you?
Yes.
You're talking about, and particularly on the pasture
But
operations, when you've got maybe 6 of them.
Yeah, but if we were to revise the general order.
Right, you'd have to go back out, right?
Yeah.
Any further comments? Thank you very much, and I take it you're going to be back here after you do some more deep thinking.
Yes.
With some amendments to the general order.
Yes.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
Go Dogs.
Go Hornets.
We'll play you any day. Moving on to agenda item 13, 2018 Triennial Review Update. This time the board will hear an update on the 2018 Joint Triennial Review of the Water Quality Control Plans for the Sacramento River, San Joaquin River Basins, and the Flurry Lake Basin. This is an information item only, and no action will be taken, although the board may ask questions and provide direction to staff. By the way, before we leave that other item, was there anybody else that wanted to testify on that? Just occurred to me that I didn't ask for interested parties.
Thank you, Dr. Longley. I was just going to interrupt you.
Pardon?
I was just going to interrupt you and ask you if you'd ask that question. But I think we're okay.
I think we're okay. Nope, I don't see anybody.
What'd
Very
you get
good.
for saying go Dogs?
That's right. Following the staff presentation, interested persons will be allowed 3 minutes each to address the board. We'll now hear the staff presentation.
Good afternoon, Chair Longley, members of the board. I'm Jay Simi, a Water Resources Control Engineer in the Basin Planning Program. With me today is Betty Yee, the Basin Planning Coordinator for the region, and also Bethany Soto from the Fresno office is here in the audience. We will be providing an information item on the initiation of the 2018 Triennial Review and the development of the work plans for basin planning activities. There is no board decision expected on this item, but this is an opportunity for the board to provide input to help us develop the next work plans. I'll begin the presentation with a brief background on the Triennial review process and address what is in your agenda package, and discuss the status of basin planning activities from the 2014 Triennial review work plans. Betty will provide additional information on the status of basin planning activities, and then she will continue the presentation by describing issues that have come up since the last Triennial review, including some newly emerging issues, existing commitments, and initial comments that we've received so far for the 2018 Triennial review. She will finish the presentation by describing the next steps to lead us to new work plans. The state's water code requires that the board adopt water quality control plans, or basin plans, that identify the beneficial uses for the water bodies in the region, establishes water quality objectives that protect those beneficial uses, and includes an implementation program to achieve the water quality objectives. The beneficial uses and the water quality objectives constitute the water quality standards required under the Federal Clean Water Act. Should water quality exceed established water quality objectives, then beneficial uses are not supported and the water body is considered impaired. The Water Board adopted 2 basin plans to cover the Central Valley. The southern third of the region is covered by the Tulare Lake Basin Plan, and the northern 2/3 of the region is covered by the Sacramento River and San Joaquin River Basin Plan. Our 2 basin plans contain water quality standards, control programs, and policies that address water quality in the Central Valley region. Per the federal and state laws, the board is required to review the water quality standards and policies contained in the basin plans every 3 years to maintain their effectiveness. What we are here to talk about today is a joint triennial review of the 2 basin plans. This review is a public process that allows us to identify and prioritize basin planning activities based on public comments received and input from the board. Issues such as existing basin plan commitments, ongoing projects already underway, and new issues raised by the public or the board could all be included in the next work plans. Staff will utilize information received during this public process to develop work plans for each of the 2 basin plans that cover approximately 3 years. The current triennial review work plans triennial review work plans, or the 2014 work plans, were adopted by the board in 2015 and covered the period from January 2015 to June 2018. The next work plans that the board will be considering are the 2018 work plans, which are expected to cover the period from July 2018 to June 2021. The work plans prioritize and summarize the need for projects, the approximate timeline, and approximate resources required from both staff and contract dollars. Prioritization is needed since there are always far more projects identified than can be accomplished with existing staff resources. Included as handout 4 in your agenda package is a brief summary of the process for completing a basin plan amendment, with most basin plan, included as handout 4 in your agenda package is a brief summary of the process for completing a basin plan amendment. With most basin plan amendments taking no less than 3 years, you can see how important prioritization is when developing these work plans. The proposed work plans will be considered by the board for approval at a public hearing, and once adopted, will be used to direct basin planning efforts. We are early in the public process to develop these work plans. Today is an opportunity for you to provide input for these work plans. Your agenda package contains some key reference documents related to the solicitation of comments for the triennial review, including a copy of the June public solicitation document, which is the second handout in your agenda package. The solicitation document was provided to the public to briefly explain the triennial review process and explain how the public can inform us of potential basin planning concerns. The solicitation document includes as attachments the status of projects under the current 2014 work plans, new planning issues that have been identified since 2014, and a template to use for submitting comments. Your agenda package also contains a summary table for the current projects and a summary of the process and minimum time frame for a basin plan amendment to provide context for the level of work associated with each work plan project. Copies of the agenda package are provided out front for members of the public. Now, let's discuss the status of the current work plans. Each work plan discussed issues that were applicable region-wide and then those that were applicable only to the individual basin planning area. A total of 14 issues were identified between the two work plans. 8 of the issues identified were applicable to the entire region and appear in both work plans. The Tulare Lake Basin had 1 additional issue, and the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins had 5 additional issues. During this triennial review period, staff have initiated or completed projects to address 12 of these issues. The next 3 slides summarize the status of the 8 region-wide issues for the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins and the Tulare Lake Basin. You have the summary table of all the issues as handout 3 in your agenda package, and there is a more detailed narrative in attachment 1 of the solicitation document included in your agenda package. Issue 1 from the work plans addresses salt and nitrate management for surface and groundwaters. During this triennial review period, the majority of effort occurred under the Central Valley Salinity Alternatives for Long-Term Sustainability, or CV SALTS initiative. CV SALTS is a stakeholder-led initiative that began in 2006 to address salinity and nitrate problems in the Central Valley. Central Valley Water Board staff and CV SALTS stakeholders completed a salt and nitrate management plan, as well as supporting case studies, and submitted these to the board. The board acknowledged receipt of the plan in March of 2017 and directed staff to initiate basin planning actions to address salinity and nitrate water quality concerns, considering, where appropriate, the recommendations in the salt and nitrate management plan. You can see here the planning efforts that have been completed or were started during this triennial review period under the CV SALTS initiative. These efforts also address other issues identified in the 2014 work plans. I will discuss them now, and they will be denoted with CV SALTS in their status columns in later slides. The projects that affected the Tulare Lake Basin are marked with TLB, and those that affected the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins are marked with SSJ. The ones with no marks applied region-wide. Because a number of these projects are to change beneficial uses, the board was given a handout today that is an excerpt from the beneficial use definitions from the Sacramento and San Joaquin Rivers Basin Plan. These are the same beneficial use definitions used for the Tulare Lake Basin Plan. I will be referring to the municipal and domestic supply beneficial use as MUN and the agricultural supply beneficial use as AGR. These 2 uses are on the first page of the beneficial uses handout. The first bulleted project is an amendment to establish new water quality objectives for salinity in the lower San Joaquin River upstream of Vernalis. The next 2 bulleted projects are a basin plan amendment to remove the MUN and AGR beneficial uses within a specified portion of the Tulare Lake bed, and the removal of the MUN beneficial use in 12 agricultural water bodies that were receiving waters from municipal wastewater dischargers. The removal of the MUN beneficial use was used as a case study to support the next bulleted item, which is the project that you considered earlier today and ultimately adopted a basin plan amendment to establish standardized region-wide process for determining appropriate MUN designations, level of protection in agriculturally dominated water bodies. The last bullet is the reevaluation of secondary maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, as water quality objectives. The salt and nitrate management plan includes recommendations for the incorporation of guidance into the basin plans to support and clarify implementations of the secondary MCLs. This guidance, along with other recommendations included in the salt and nitrate management plan, will be considered in future basin plan amendments. As I stated on the previous slide, a number of region-wide planning efforts identified in the 2014 work plan are being completed under the CV SALTS initiative. They're being completed under the CV SALTS initiative, and they are noted with CV SALTS on this table. In issues 2, 3, and 6 from the 2014 work plan have projects, which I described on the last slide, that fall into this category. However, several of these issues have projects that are not addressed through the CV Salts initiative that I want to bring to your attention. CV Salts projects address MUN and AGR beneficial uses. Under issues 2 and 3, there are other basin planning efforts underway to address other beneficial uses in the region. Issue 4 of the work plans called for regulatory guidance to address water bodies dominated by wastewater discharges. Work addressing this issue was not started due to lack of resources. Issue 5 from the work plans directed staff to participate and collaborate in development of plans and policies with the State Water Board to represent interests of our region. These plans and policies are listed in Attachment 1 of the solicitation document included in your agenda package. Item 7 from the work plans concerned the appropriateness of existing water quality objectives and beneficial uses for the protection of salmonids and other aquatic species. During this triennial review period, 2 agreements were processed to start development of a method to derive temperature ranges to protect Central Valley anadromous salmonids. Staff have also investigated the impairment of beneficial uses due to low dissolved oxygen in Old and Middle River and is drafting a white paper. The white paper will identify potential control actions to improve dissolved oxygen concentrations. Finally, the last work plan issue that applies to the entire region was consideration of the need to establish or update water quality objectives based upon recommended criteria published by US EPA. During this triennial review period, the Central Valley Water Board initiated basin plan amendments to adopt or revise water quality objectives and an implementation program for ammonia. Public scoping meetings on the potential amendment were held in March of 2017. This slide and the next 3 list the high priority issues that were identified specifically for either the Tulare Lake Basin or the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins. Issue 9 of the Tulare Lake Basin plan, Issue 9 of the Tulare Lake Basin work plan has to do with effluent limitations for salinity measured as electrical conductivity, or EC, for waste discharges. The Tulare Lake is a closed basin and salt accumulation is unavoidable. The basin plan implements controlled degradation and salt management. One of these elements is to allow incremental increases in salt by limiting waste discharge quality to 500 micromoles per centimeter over the EC of the source water, or 1,000 micromoles per centimeter, whichever is less. Water conservation measures tend to reduce effluent volume and increase salinity concentration, even though the total salt load does not increase. Compliance with these effluent limitations could potentially impact water conservation efforts, so stakeholders are requesting that the Central Valley Water Board consider revising the effluent limitations and reevaluate their appropriateness in the basin plan. As mentioned previously, Issue 1 from the 2014 work plans is to address salt and nitrate concerns in the region. We expect the eventual basin plan amendments will need to address the EC limitations in the Tulare Lake Basin Plan. Future basin planning activities may be needed to address residual concerns, if any. At this point, I'll hand things over to Betty to talk about issues from the Sacramento and San Joaquin Rivers work plan, along with a summary of the initial comments we've received to date and next steps for the triennial review.
Thank you, Jay, and good afternoon to the board members. The first of the work plan issues identified specifically for the Sacramento River and San Joaquin River basins was the implementation of basin planning actions resulting from implementation of the Delta Strategic Work Plan. The Delta Strategic Work Plan was originally adopted by the Central Valley, San Francisco Bay, and State Water Boards in 2008, with an updated version approved by the Central Valley Water Board in 2014. The status of the basin planning task from the Delta Strategic Work Plan are included in Attachment 1 of the solicitation document, which is in your agenda package. I would like to take a moment to highlight a few of the projects. A basin plan amendment and control program for pyrethroid pesticides was adopted by the board in June of this year, and white papers have been finalized to support development of the Delta Nutrient Research Plan. You'll be hearing more about the Delta Nutrient Research Plan during a separate agenda item after this triennial review item. A number of these tasks overlap with other work plan issues as noted in the progress column. So I will be discussing these tasks later in this presentation when I discuss issues 10 and 11. Tasks identified in the Delta Strategic Work Plan that are not related to basin planning, such as the Delta Regional Monitoring Program, provide their own status updates to the board. Issue 10 from the 2014 Work Plan for the Sacramento and San Joaquin River Basins had to do with pesticide control efforts by the board to address impairments. There is some overlap between this work and the task called for in the Delta Strategic Work Plan. In addition to the adoption of the pyrethroid control program I mentioned on the previous slide, a staff report is in development to summarize the status of impairments due to the herbicide diuron, and a contract is in place to identify toxicity thresholds of current use fungicides on algal species in the Delta. Many of the pesticide impairments are being addressed through our existing regulatory programs, such as management plans being implemented under the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. Although not basin planning work, this does have significant implications for the basin planning program. These impairments being addressed by the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program management plans would otherwise be identified as requiring a basin plan control program. Addressing these impairments through our existing regulatory programs means that planning resources can be directed to other basin planning activities in the region. Issue 11 from the work plan was the mercury load reduction program, which is another issue where there is some overlap with the Delta Strategic Work Plan. During the current triennial review period, staff assisted in the development of the statewide mercury water quality objectives and have been developing the statewide mercury control program for reservoirs. The initiation of a project to address mercury impairments in the Delta tributary rivers and creeks was delayed due to these efforts and is just now starting. The final two issues, issues 12 and 13, address concerns in Battle Creek and the Pitt River. Battle Creek is one of the northernmost major tributaries to the Sacramento River below Shasta and is considered a high priority stream because it contains critical cold water habitat for important populations of Chinook salmon and Central Valley steelhead, contains numerous fish hatcheries, and is the location of an ongoing salmonid restoration project. During this triennial review period, the board funded contracts to compile available water quality data and literature, and staff has continued working with stakeholders to develop a watershed plan that will help direct efforts to investigate actions to address the excessive sedimentation. A review of beneficial uses and water quality objectives in the Pitt River was identified as a medium priority in the 2014 work plan, and available resources were directed to higher priority projects. However, during the development of the 2014 integrated report, stakeholders requested the Central Valley Water Board reevaluate the beneficial use designations and water quality objectives. The Basin Plan identifies the same beneficial uses for the entire Pitt River, even though it is over 200 miles long, with varying elevations and characteristics. Also, the Pitt River geology suggests that standard water quality objectives that are appropriate for the rest of the Central Valley streams may not be appropriate for the Pitt River. The next several slides identify basin planning issues that have arisen before the board since the 2014 Triennial Review and may be part of issues that need to be prioritized in the upcoming work plans. During development of the 2014 Integrated Report, which was presented to the board in December 2016, stakeholders requested basin planning actions outside the scope of the water quality assessment activities that generate the Integrated Report. Stakeholders requested that certain water bodies in the Stanislaus National Forest with high bacteria levels should have their water contact recreation beneficial use designation reevaluated due to their high elevation, ephemeral nature, and lack of suitable areas for swimming. If the board undertook this project and found that full protection of water contact recreation was not appropriate, The board can designate a use representing a lower level of protection. If water contact recreation was entirely inappropriate, non-contact water recreation would still be a designated beneficial use. The definitions of the beneficial uses for water contact and non-water contact recreation are in your beneficial uses handout that was provided today. These uses are abbreviated as REC 1 and REC 2 respectively. You will find the definitions on the second page of the handout. Stakeholders also requested that the board update the fecal indicator bacteria criteria for water contact recreation to be consistent with the latest science. There were also comments that the water quality objectives for dissolved oxygen and pH should be revised to reflect their daily fluctuations due to local hydrology and algal conditions. During the public process for other basin planning projects, stakeholders identified additional potential planning efforts, including request to reconsider the water quality objective for Dial Bend Carb, as well as the prohibition of discharge and time schedule that was adopted as part of the original rice program in 1990 for the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins. Dial Bend Carb is an herbicide used in rice production. The basin plan water quality objective of 1 microgram per liter is the same as the current secondary maximum contaminant level to protect against taste and odor in drinking water. It should be noted that there's also a primary maximum contaminant level which protects public health, set at 70 micrograms per liter. There were also requests to remove the prospective incorporation by reference of the Title 22 maximum contaminant levels as water quality objectives protective of the immune beneficial use. The Title 22 maximum contaminant levels are standards to protect drinking water. The concern over the prospective incorporation by reference is that the process of adopting the maximum contaminant levels does not consider the factors that the board is required to consider when adopting water quality objectives. These same factors must be considered by the board when adopting effluent limitations in permits. When the board uses water quality objectives that have been evaluated against these factors, then the board does not have to consider them again when the water quality objectives are used to develop effluent limitations. There was also a request that the board did not address the prospective incorporation by reference. Then the board should specifically prevent the 1,2,3 trichloropropane maximum contaminant level from automatically becoming a water quality objective. Also called 1,2,3 TCP, this chemical is man-made and found at industrial and hazardous waste sites, and has been found in solvents and pesticides and is highly stable in the environment. It is recognized in California as a carcinogen, and the State Water Board is making it a high priority to establish a maximum contaminant level for this chemical. And recently, the board held a workshop to identify strategies to address climate change impacts to water quality. Basin planning actions are anticipated to be a part of these strategies. Some issues have recently been brought to staff's attention and will likely require board prioritization.
Just a minute, let's go back to that. I lost you somewhere back there. The previous, oh, that slide, yes. In response to other basin planning activities, remove the prospective incorporation by reference of MCLs. I don't understand quite what that means.
Which part? The first part is that when we do a basin plan amendment and scope it, there's a certain amount of things we can do to make changes to the basin plan. Often during the public review process, we get comments that are not part of that scope of that project, and those comments get forwarded for the for board to consider during the triennial review. So we have received numerous comments to reevaluate the prospective incorporation by reference of the MCLs. The prospective incorporation by reference of the MCLs allows the board to automatically make the MCLs as their revised water quality objectives without going through a basin plan amendment process. And that is the exact process that the commenters would like us to rethink, and instead of allowing the MCLs from automatically becoming our water quality objectives, that would there be an opportunity for public review against the 6 factors in Port of Cologne against these water quality objectives, either new or revised, before making them water quality objectives in the basin plan.
Then that leads to the sub-bullet. So folks are saying that you've got comments that don't allow 1,2,3 trichloropropane to become a WQO, is that correct?
Yes. Currently.
So Dr. Longley, when the State Board just recently adopted their MCL, and one of the comments made to the Division of Drinking Water was that since some of our basin plans incorporate these by reference, that they should also have to do the 13241 analysis that's required in order to establish water quality objectives. And the argument from Division of Drinking Water is that that's not their jurisdiction. And so that's what's being asked here, is instead of us just automatically bringing them in and calling them water quality objectives, that there become a process that we do that analysis.
And what's your recommendation on that?
Well, right now it has to be done through a permit-by-permit basis. So for having them come in a consistent manner and being applied, that it would make sense to do it that way. The thing is the board hasn't ever done it that way. I agree with what they're saying. A lot of the process, and I've said to this board before, some of the things that the Division of Drinking Water have to evaluate when taking a public health goal and converting it to an MCL are some of the very factors we have to consider in the 13241. So I haven't really looked at what other things would have to be done, but it might be something this board might want to consider. It's a policy call from the board. It would make it much easier for permit writers if we did that. Then they could just use the number as opposed to having to spell it out in each of their orders.
So when are we going to have the opportunity to delve into this a little deeper?
Well, this is they're identifying all the issues that will be brought up during this triennial review, so the discussion will be happening through this process.
And when are we going to have the final?
That's coming later in my presentation.
Okay, go
Okay,
ahead.
well,
If
wait.
you want to jump to the end and see the surprise ending.
I
we
do
were-
want to interrupt here. Okay.
I could look at this, I guess.
I want to interrupt just a little bit because I think your question is, if your question is when are we really going to be looking into this policy decision
Yes,
of removing
yes.
the perspective, that's actually part of the CV salts process in the policy that's being reviewed right now in the group on how to utilize secondary MCLs. One of the recommendations that has come up in that process is the removal of this perspective incorporation by reference. So we will be discussing it through that process, which will overlap. That's just the secondary MCLs, but it'll provide some of the initial discussion as we go further into this if we decide to prioritize this as an issue in the triennial review.
Very good, thank you.
Okay, some issues have recently been brought to staff's attention and will likely require board prioritization in the 2018 Triennial Review work plans. The State Water Board adopted new beneficial use definitions when it adopted mercury provisions into the Water Quality Control Plan for inland surface waters, enclosed bays, and estuaries of California. The new beneficial use categories are tribal tradition and culture, tribal subsistence fishing, and subsistence fishing. The beneficial uses handout that you are provided today includes these new definitions at the bottom of the third page. These new beneficial use definitions have not yet been adopted into our basin plans. Tribes have contacted staff to request information on how to designate tribal uses. The next two bullets are about the board's designation of the immune beneficial use. In 1988, the State Water Board adopted the Sources of Drinking Water policy that directed regional boards to designate all the surface and groundwaters to be protected as sources of drinking water with the immune designation. When the Central Valley Water Board incorporated the sources of drinking water into the basin plans, the board designated the immune beneficial use to waters that were not already explicitly identified with beneficial uses. This blanket designation of the immune beneficial use has resulted in instances where application of the municipal and domestic supply beneficial use is not appropriate. In the Tulare Lake Basin, Oil producers have been injecting wastewater into aquifers that have been administratively exempted by EPA from being considered a source of drinking water under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. Since many of these aquifers are designated with municipal and domestic supply beneficial use under the Tulare Lake Basin Plan, dischargers are subject to lawsuit under California's Proposition 65, which is the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act of 1986. Most wetlands have not been evaluated to identify appropriate beneficial uses, so they were designated MUNE when the board incorporated the sources of drinking water into our basin plans. So dischargers to wetlands are required to meet water quality-based effluent limitations to protect the MUNE beneficial use, even though the use is neither occurring nor expected to occur, and wetland managers want the wastewater to support the wetland habitat. Another issue has been the need to designate the commercial and sport fishing beneficial use, which is the beneficial use that covers consumption of organisms from a water body. The only designation of this beneficial use to our basin plans has been when the board adopts a mercury control program designed to protect this beneficial use. The commercial and sport fishing beneficial use is defined in the second page of the beneficial uses handout and is abbreviated COM. So up to now, we have been talking about issues that the board has prioritized in the 2014 work plan and issues that have come up since adoption of the 2014 work plans. There are basin plan actions such as studies, reviews, and consideration of new control programs that the board committed to when it adopted amendments to the basin plans in the past, and these commitments have not been included in the past triennial review work plans. Several of the reviews have been completed, but a number remain. The actions listed on this slide are now due. Attachment 2 of the solicitation document, which is in your agenda package, contains more details regarding these commitments. Items that are due are a review of the rice pesticides program and mercury control programs for Clear Lake and Cache Creek watersheds. The Basin Plan also has a requirement to adopt new mercury control programs for tributaries to the Delta. We also said that we would review the Clear Lake Nutrients Control Program and consider amending the Basin Plan. This review is just now starting. So the last slide described the Basin Plan commitments that are currently due. There are also Basin Plan commitments that are not yet due, but need to be worked on during this next triennial review period. The actions listed on this slide are due to be completed during the 2018 triennial review period and will need to be included for prioritization in the next work plan. These include review of the compliance schedule for the selenium control program for the lower San Joaquin River, development of a groundwater control program for sources of salt discharges into the lower San Joaquin River if the water quality objectives for the lower San Joaquin River are not being attained, development of a mercury offset program, and review of the Delta methylmercury control program. Now I would like to discuss early comments that we have received for the 2018 work plans. So far, we have received comments from an individual and the Sacramento Regional County Sanitation District. We have included the comments as handouts for today's meeting, and the comments have been posted on our website. Dennis Fox identified water quality concerns with mercury, asbestos, selenium, and septic systems. Some of the water quality discharge issues that he identified are not basin plan issues, but might require board investigation. The Sacramento Regional County Sanitation District encouraged the Central Valley Water Board to work with the State Water Board, wastewater agencies, industry, and agriculture in these important basin planning actions. The district supports the work of the regional board staff and provided comments on the following issues. The district supported the Central Valley Water Board participation in state board plans and policies and recommended that we consider using a holistic approach to address beneficial use impairments by considering the combination of contaminants and flow. Make sure that water quality can support any proposed designation of beneficial uses, and develop control programs that focus on controlling major sources of contaminants while providing a process for de minimis dischargers to obtain relief. The district also recommended that results of the work on developing temperature criteria be used to update the state board's thermal plan, and the district recommended that a stakeholder process be used to guide the temperature work. The district supported efforts to complete the Delta Nutrient Research Plan and encouraged the Central Valley Water Board to develop variances and variance programs to provide relief for surface water dischargers that can demonstrate that it is infeasible for them to meet water quality-based effluent limitations. The notice requesting comments has gone out. We are currently in the phase of gathering comments for the next work plan. Today is an opportunity for the board to provide comments to use for development of the work plans. Workshops give the public an opportunity to verbally comment on the high priority issues identified, emerging issues, and other necessary basin planning actions. Workshops are scheduled for next Wednesday in Fresno and August 23rd here at the Rancho Cordova office. The August 23rd workshop will be video conference with Reading. Written comments are due at the end of August. After August, staff will compile and review all public comments and prepare a list of basin planning issues. A draft work plan will be prepared for each basin plan, which will include proposed actions to address every issue and the resources needed to perform those actions. The draft work plans and our response to comments will be made available for additional public review and comment before being presented to the board. Staff will modify the draft work plans as necessary and respond to any new comments prior to board consideration of the draft work plans. The Triennial review hearing for both basin plans is tentatively scheduled to be presented to the board for adoption during the June 2018 board meeting. This concludes our presentation. We are happy to answer any questions and welcome any input and comment on issues for inclusion in the draft work plans. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Betty? Great job, hard work, keep it up. No, it's really staggering the amount of work and different programs that goes on, and my thanks go out to you for the.
I have a comment.
Yes.
This is really a big deal at this point in time. I mean, this is very important. I hope we do everything we can to let the public know this is the opportunity to, show up and say something. And so my question would be, if the deadline is August and we don't see anything as a board until, June of 18, how do you react when somebody sends you something in September or October?
In the time between now and June, we'll be working on trying to put together the draft work plans and the response to comments. When those are made available to the public, the board will also be notified. And at that time, you can request additional staff presentation to you, or you can wait until the hearing and comment to us at that time.
If it can fit in, I think we need another workshop prior to the hearing in June.
Okay.
I think that's what I'm saying is, there'll be people that'll find out about it, say, I missed my opportunity. Well, give them another chance.
Do I assume that the 2 of the 14 items that didn't get completed get rolled over in the last board plan?
It's not an automatic rollover, and this is something that I really want to stress. You just saw a tremendous workload. The items that are not completed, the items that have been brought up during other basin planning processes, the items that are currently commitments in our own basin plan that need to be reviewed, and then new items that you may come up with or we may hear about. I just want to keep paramount in the board's mind that we only have 15 or less staff to work on all of these projects. So the prioritization part is critical, and staff will be bringing to you our best estimate, knowing the needs and what can be accomplished within a 3-year period, which projects are almost complete that we want to completely finish, which ones are commitments that we feel are critical for public health reasons or may be foundational to other projects that are moving forward. but it's really going to be a hard decision for the board to be looking at all of these high priority projects and figure out where are we going to go in the 3-year period. So our job will be trying to give it our prioritization, trying to let you know the context of each of the issues, what it would take as far as timing, resources, and resources, both staff and contract dollars. And then we'll be making our proposal to you, and that's when we'll be having a discussion. So I think a workshop is probably going to be critical because of the number of controversial projects that we see right now.
I would agree. Thank you. Any further comments?
I just want to say that anytime the word salt is used in one of these priorities, Carl's ears go up. And for me, it's mercury, so I appreciate all the work on mercury issues.
Well, between salt and mercury, we need more PYs than this board has, so. Anything else that board members want to say on this issue?
The 2 meetings will be webcast, so we can watch on the web.
Just the one. The one's already been held in Fresno.
No, actually, we're going to be going to Fresno next Wednesday.
Oh, is it next
And
Wednesday?
then the Wednesday after that, it'll be here, but we are only going to be video conferencing that one.
The one that's here.
Yeah.
We don't have that capability in Fresno. We can't do that. We don't have the
Oh,
equipment.
I looked at that date wrong. It's the 16th, is that right?
Right.
For some reason, I thought, this meeting's been so long, I thought it was the 30th already. I'm sorry. Long day today. I'm sorry, yes. Anything else? We'll move on to the next item then.
Great job, staff.
Any comments
you.
from the public?
Oh, yes, any interested person wishing to comment. Bruce, you haven't said anything all day, and I didn't want to say that because I knew you'd be standing up there. Got to put it up a little higher.
Speak. Bruce Haddleshell, Northern California Water Association, Sac Valley Water Quality Coalition. October 19th, when you visit the Pitt River, look at what PG&E advocated, I don't know how many years ago. The segmentations, the upper end of the pit near Alturas has a different pH standard in the basin plan already than other parts, and this makes sense. And, you know, we've had independent gone out with dissolved oxygen with regional board staff and Larry Ferrero from up there and taken samples, and we've got information, and somehow we'll talk about it on the 19th when you're up there, because you'll see the segmentation. Not only on that, but I think PG&E recommended segmentation of other rivers in the Triennial review. Keep it up, I'm out of here, so you can finish up.
So, Bruce, I did see you, when you came in, the Pitt River slide was up, and I saw you give a little fist pump, and you were excited to see that. And
Yeah, you know what, I was afraid. I was giving the fist pump because I thought she was talking about Pitt River, but she was talking about Hat Creek and sedimentation, so I was like, well, lower that fist pump.
so, but I got to say the Pitt River issues are piquing my interest because I've never
Yeah.
been up there, so I'm looking forward to the 19th.
Yeah,
That's been on the list. It's on the list as not being completed, and it'll continue to be considered by the board. And I just have to emphasize the board right now, a lot of staff resources are going towards completing the CV salts efforts, and
Yeah.
that has to get through. And so that's one of the highest priorities for the board right now.
Pamela makes a real important point. I, too, have been up to the Pitt River, and a couple times, in fact, I've been up there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it snowed one time you were there.
yeah, and of course, Dan lives up there, and John's visited.
Yeah, he lives in Fall River.
Okay. But the point is there are so many important issues that, as Jeannie pointed out, and I made the somewhat facetious comment that if you consider just salt and arsenic, that's more PYs than the board has. We have a tough time on prioritizing. And so the next time, and I would presume maybe the April board meeting that we have this back in front of us, we've got some real work to do, because we've got to really look at priorities and make decisions on what is the most important among some very important issues. And that's not easy work, so.
No, I want to acknowledge that, and I think Betty may have said this before I came in, but certainly we've been involved along with the other dischargers in Clear Lake, and there's a public workshop August 28th that Holly Grover is having and we'll be involved in because it's
Good.
important, right?
Good.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other interested persons? Thank you very much. We'll move on to agenda item 14, status update on the Delta Nutrient Research Plan. At this time, the board will hear a status update on the Delta Nutrient Research Plan. Information item only, no action taken, although the board may ask questions and provide direction. Staff presentation, after that occurs, interested persons 3 minutes each, and we'll start with the staff presentation.
Dr. Longley, I just, our court reporter is under a tight timeline. I just wanted to let her know if this is just an information item, so you're welcome to leave if you have to go, so.
I appreciate that, and if I've been seen to be pushing a little bit, our court reporter has to leave at 5, and I've been trying to get pushed to get everything on the record. Thank you. Go ahead,
Okay.
Janice.
Good afternoon, Chairman Longley and members of the board. I'm Dr. Janice Cook, an environmental scientist in the planning section here in Sacramento. About a year and a half ago, I took over from Chris Foe to work on the Delta Nutrient Research Plan. My purpose today is to give you a report about that plan. I will describe the background, the progress to date, and the next steps. This is an information item. I hope to make it interesting, and staff is not recommending that you make any decisions at this time. Okay, so on this item. First, I'll set the stage. So the focus is nutrients and their effects in the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. So we have here a map of the Delta. City of Sacramento is at the top. Our main rivers flowing through the Delta, the Sacramento and the San Joaquin. Throughout the presentation, I'll be talking broadly about nutrient issues in the Delta, but we don't see the same problems everywhere in the Delta. Water flows and varied land uses underlie a very complex system. Freshwater flows bring in both water and nutrients, and they're responsible for net transport through the Delta. We have tidal action in the Delta that's also important. It's responsible for mixing and dispersing nutrients and organisms throughout the Delta, and we actually see tidal fluctuation all the way up to Sacramento and Stockton. The Delta has a wide variety of habitats, included leveed Delta deep channels, dead-end sloughs, shallow open water, and tidal wetlands, particularly in the Yellow Bypass and in Suisun Marsh. These varied habitats use nutrients and support biological communities differently. So I find it helpful to remember the complexity of the Delta when considering the issues and potential for management actions to be effective.
Candace, real quick.
Yep.
Go back. That red is the official Delta.
That is the legal Delta boundary from the state statute.
And is that, just remind me, is that completely within our jurisdiction?
No. There is a very tiny portion on the very western side there that is actually in Region 2. Okay. So in this slide, I will give a general overview of nutrient-related water quality issues. First, harmful algal blooms. When I talk about a bloom, that's a dense collection of cells. Sometimes we see them as scum or mats. And some of the harmful algae produce toxins that cause serious harm to people, pets, and wildlife. Blooms and their toxins impact drinking water supplies and recreation. This board has heard and read in the EO report reports of cyanobacteria blooms in water bodies in the region. We also see these in the Delta. The next issue is overgrowth of invasive aquatic plants, and I'm going to be using the term macrophytes. In the Delta, we have both floating and submerged non-native plants that cause problems by forming dense colonies, and these dense colonies cause problems by they impede navigation and water supply structures. They also change clarity and water flow in the Delta. And I should point out these These plant and algal mats, and especially when they decay, contribute to low dissolved oxygen problems. Okay. But there are other algae types and microscopic plants in the water column that use nutrients, and I'm going to use the term phytoplankton later in the presentation for these. They support the base of our food web and provide food for fish and other organisms. We can monitor the presence of the harmful algae, macrophytes, and phytoplankton. It's also important to know how much of these are eaten by organisms in the delta. Invasive clam species in the delta and Sassoon Bay have dramatically affected the food web because they consume large amounts of phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are also needed by small invertebrates that feed our fish, and that's represented by that little orange critter in the picture. All of the growth of the phytoplankton and the plants are also affected by the physical factors in the delta. These include our water flow, water residence time, light, and temperature. The nutrient-related issues in the delta divide generally into two groups. Too many nutrients can result in eutrophication. I just described these issues of harmful algae blooms, low dissolved oxygen, and invasive aquatic plants. Beginning in 1999, scientists at Department of Water Resources observed blooms of harmful cyanobacteria, commonly called blue-green algae, particularly microcystis. There were problems in the Delta last year in Tracy Oasis Marina. I just noticed that in Contra Costa County Public Health issued a notice of harmful algae in Discovery Bay. But on the other hand, some of the nutrients are needed to support a healthy ecosystem. So problems related to excess nutrients in parts of the delta need to be balanced with providing nutrition for the base of the aquatic food web. The graph here is of concentrations of chlorophyll in the San Joaquin River in the central delta. Chlorophyll is a pigment in algae, so we're really measuring the concentration of phytoplankton in the water column. And the thing to notice about the graphic, and we see this elsewhere in the delta, is about since the mid-1990s, I'm sorry if the dates on the bottom are difficult to read, but that's data from 1975 to 2012. We just don't see as high peaks during monthly monitoring. Okay, so how do we address these problems holistically? Well, the Delta Stewardship Council, when it adopted its Delta Plan in 2013, included a water quality recommendation that the Central Valley Water Board be involved in developing a nutrient research plan for the Delta. This board took on that task, and as Betty mentioned, developing a nutrient plan is part of the Delta Strategic Work Plan that this board adopted in 2014, and it's one of our high Delta priorities. Staff is developing the nutrient research plan to fulfill part of the Water Board's Delta priorities. And the purpose of the plan is to identify research and modeling that are needed to determine whether water quality objectives for nutrients are needed in the Delta to protect our beneficial uses. Following the direction in the strategic work plan, the nutrient research plan will address the following nutrient-related water quality concerns. And I'm using terminology that's in the strategic work plan. We will address harmful algal blooms, invasive aquatic plants, low primary production, that's the support for the base of the food web, and low dissolved oxygen. And I should note that when I'm talking about nutrients, I mean nitrogen and phosphorus. And these nutrients are necessary for plant and algae growth. Okay. As an initial step, staff invited stakeholders, to participate in a stakeholder and technical advisory group. Members of that group represent a range of interests involved in water quality issues in the Delta. A formal charter for the group was finalized in July of 2015. The Stakeholder and Technical Advisory Group has met 15 times. They're a very dedicated group, and I appreciate all of their time and their input. It's been very helpful. The group has provided comment and recommendations to Water Board staff on both the technical and the policy-related topics. Our stakeholder meetings have been advertised and open to the public. We also have overlap between membership of this group with the San Francisco Bay's nutrient management strategy. San Francisco Bay is undergoing a parallel effort. They're somewhat ahead of where we are. Adam is a member of the Bay Nutrient Management Steering Committee, and I'm his alternate. So, okay. As a first step of working with the STAG, we actually added 2 topics to be covered in the nutrient research plan: nutrient-related issues for drinking water and how to best develop numeric models. Okay. So the Delta Nutrient Research Plan is in progress. I'll give you a timeline at the very end of the presentation. I'm going to describe to you now the steps that are completed thus far. As I mentioned, an early step was forming the Stakeholder and Technical Advisory Group. And those staff and stakeholders began by naming science work groups and commissioning a white paper for each of our topic areas to be covered in the Nutrient Research Plan. The white papers were written by experts. Those were a mix of local and external scientists and researchers. When we started out, we realized that we needed more information on what's the state of our science. So the purpose of the white papers was to describe the state of the science and identify gaps in our understanding. Science work groups, comprised of local researchers, were involved in planning and review of the white papers and in helping define our data gaps. The white papers are now complete, and they are available on the Water Board's website for this program. From the white paper process, we now have research recommendations for work in each topic area. These have been compiled, and staff and stakeholders have developed a process for prioritizing those research recommendations. I want to call your attention to your handout. That handout describes the prioritization process. We have criteria for prioritizing the research recommendations, management questions, and then at the very end is a list of the research recommendations that we've compiled from the white papers. Oops. The next step will be completing the nutrient research plan itself, and I'll come back to this schematic later in the presentation to discuss the steps forward. I'm going to take a few moments now to describe what we've learned from the white papers. I'll start with 3 overarching themes, then spend a slide on each of the white papers. There were some points that were common to all of the white papers. First, we learned that responses to nutrients in the Delta depend on conditions of other factors. These other factors such as light, temperature, flow, water residence times, microbes that are involved in recycling of the nutrients, and in organisms like clams that are taking up our phytoplankton. Because of this, monitoring and assessment of the effects of nutrients should incorporate an understanding of all of these biological, chemical, and physical factors. And finally, models are necessary tools for understanding the complex relationships in the Delta and to test management scenarios. Okay. Now for each of the white paper issues. One white paper and science work group focused on nutrients and invasive aquatic plants or macrophytes. The white paper authors told us that management of nutrients alone is unlikely to limit macrophyte growth in the Delta. However, nutrient reduction may boost the effectiveness of current macrophyte control measures. I mean things like spraying and the manual removal of macrophytes in the Delta. Department of Boating Waterways has had an active aquatic weed control program in the Delta since 1983. The white paper authors told us that, moving on to the research needs, more research is needed to understand the connections between nutrients and macrophytes. These authors recommended monitoring to track location, timing, and extent of macrophyte colonies in the Delta. Also, in order to understand whether nutrient control would help the macrophyte problem, we need more information on growth rates as functions of nutrient concentrations. And finally, we lack data on the effects of macrophytes and their control measures on native species in the Delta.
So impact on the native species themselves. by these introduced species?
Impacts on, well, you could say both. Are we preferentially harming the native phytoplankton that are best food sources for the delta smelt? And that's also on the cyanobacteria slide. So, the delta smelt resiliency strategy is looking at effects of herbicides on delta smelt, but we need information on the other parts of the food web. Okay, so. The next white paper I'll talk about is our one on nutrients and harmful algal blooms. First I'll say that the photo is courtesy of the Tracy Oasis Marina operators. That's in the South Delta off of Grant Line Canal, and that's what their waterway looked like in summer of 2016. The white paper authors, some of their key findings were that light, residence time, and temperature are keys to initiation of blooms in the delta. In other words, we have enough nutrients in most cases, but the blooms need nutrients in order to persist. Thus, nutrient reduction may limit our bloom duration and severity. The white paper authors described key research needs. One of these is we need more information about the location, timing, and extent of harmful algal blooms and their toxins. This will help us put together information with the other factors. And potential for the nutrient levels or other factors to be preferentially helping cyanobacteria to grow in the delta. Okay. Next white paper on nutrients and phytoplankton. This was also sometimes called the nutrient forms paper. And by phytoplankton, I mean the single-celled aquatic plants or algae that we want to see in the delta that are important as food for tiny organisms that are eaten by our native fish. This was the most complicated white paper to produce because there's been actually a significant amount of research on this topic, particularly in the North Delta. The studies have reported a range of results. So in November of 2016, we hosted a day-long workshop with colleagues from the Bay Nutrient Management Strategy. There were presentations about local studies, and these were given before an independent panel of national experts. And the panel then wrote our white paper. Key findings from the workshop and white paper are that physical factors, biogeochemical processes, and phytoplankton species differences are important for interpreting field and laboratory studies. And that really means that to understand what's happening in the various studies, we need to look at what were the physical factors, what was happening in the water and the sediment, and what phytoplankton species were involved. They also recommended that we consider management of both nitrogen and phosphorus when considering objectives in the delta. They identified research needs of learning more about cycling of nitrogen and phosphorus forms in various habitats. And they really stressed that we need broader research in order to understand all the factors that control phytoplankton and potential effects of likely changes in the delta, such as climate change and changes in nutrient management. Okay. Next one is the nutrients in drinking water white paper. This topic area was unique in that it covered a larger geographical area to include the drinking water conveyance and reservoir system extending south of the delta. White paper authors reported that harmful algal blooms and macrophyte problems are shared in the delta and also in the drinking water system. Additional issues that they describe for the drinking water system are the taste and odor compounds. These are produced by cyanobacteria that happen to be different species than the ones that produce toxins. And that the main rivers are the primary nutrient sources to the State Water Project drinking water system. Research needs identified in this white paper are analyses of harmful algal blooms, macrophytes, and their co-occurring factors in the delta and in the drinking water system. And they recommended that we develop models to examine future nutrient changes in the delta. Actually, modeling, I'll go back to that overarching remind you of the overarching theme paper or slide. Models was an issue that was talked about in all of the white papers. So this is the last white paper I'll talk about. Actually, scientific panels writing before we began developing the nutrient research plan called for development of mathematical models. So what we asked the white paper authors to do was to describe to us what would be needed for a successful approach to modeling for our nutrients and water quality issues. They came back and they told us that multiple models will be needed, that no one model can answer all of the questions. A successful approach is going to need support for monitoring, data sharing, data analyses that involves people in different fields and disciplines, and coordination between different parties involved. This is a big undertaking. The white paper authors actually estimated that to do it to the point where we could get all of our data analyses, develop the models, and test all of our questions, it could be up to a 10-year process. But they left us with some encouraging information that the model development can proceed in stages. And the first step, they said, was to add nutrient models to our existing flow models. There are good flow models already in the Delta. To start there, and then refine the models as the next step. Okay. So I wanted to explain a little bit more about the recommended stages. The white paper describes the connections that should be made between models for hydrodynamics, by that I mean the flow rates and flow volumes, and other components for water quality, movement of particles affect our light in the water column, chemical changes, and then growth of plants and algae. The goal is to have models for different components of the system that are interconnected and use outputs from each other. And a goal would also then be to have these models then connect with those models being developed for San Francisco Bay. And for the boxes in color that point out the hydrodynamic models, the Delta food webs, and the San Francisco Bay, I would say those models are well on their way. The boxes in white show the ones where new or better models are needed to really be able to do what we want to do. Okay. So that concludes my summaries of the white papers. Now I'll go back to the figures showing our progress. We've completed the white papers, compiled our research recommendations from the white papers, and developed a process that can be used to prioritize the recommendations. The immediate next step is to finish writing the nutrient research plan. It's going to be reviewed by stakeholders. We also plan to submit it for an external science review. Then the revised plan will be brought back to you for comment and consideration. Also, because the Delta Nutrient Research Plan is a recommendation within the Delta Plan, staff also intends to present it to the Delta Stewardship Council. Oops, already talked about that. So, even though the Nutrient Research Plan is under development, I wanted to tell you about some of our early implementation activities. The Water Board is supporting 2 contracts that fit with different research needs thus far. Betty mentioned one of these already. But the first one, we're initiating a contract for nutrient modeling in the Delta. This is a joint project with the San Francisco Bay Water Board. Nutrient models are in process for San Francisco Bay, including San Pablo and Suisun Bays. So this new contract would enable the modeling effort to be extended up into the Delta. The second contract is the one that Betty mentioned, laboratory testing of toxicity of selected herbicides and fungicides to phytoplankton species that occur in the Delta. And finally, I do want to mention that one of the focus areas of the Delta Regional Monitoring Program is nutrients. The Regional Monitoring Program is currently supporting analyses of nutrient data in the Delta going back over decades. They're also supporting some new monitoring that are going to be very helpful to the information that we need. As you might expect, the list of research recommendations, which are shown in the handout, are more than this agency can accomplish with available staff and funding. So one of our staff's key tasks is to seek funding and partnerships. And I do believe there are opportunities to coordinate. I'm not going to describe all of these projects in detail, but there's overlap in interest and research needs with projects being undertaken by the Bay Nutrient Management Strategy, the Delta Science Program, and the Interagency Ecological Program. Okay. So, last slide. So here's our anticipated schedule for finishing the Delta Nutrient Research Plan. Staff's goal is to release an initial draft, in October. The initial draft will undergo review by stakeholders. And as I mentioned, we plan to submit the draft nutrient research plan for external review, preferably by the State Water Board's Science Advisory Panel that's currently working on the biostimulatory substances project. Following the review and revisions by staff, we'll bring the report back to you. At this time, and I anticipate that'll be early in 2018. At that time, we anticipate asking you to accept the plan, consider the plan, and consider a resolution to direct staff's further actions to implement the plan. We would present to the Delta Stewardship Council then in spring of 2018. Since we heard information about the Delta Strategic Work Plan, I'll note that this schedule is for completion is behind what's in that Delta Strategic Work Plan, but we spent more time up front gathering some of the latest information in white papers and identifying specific information gaps. And the original schedule contained more steps for information and review. And that's all I have for you, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Janice. That's a lot of work. It's kind of mind-boggling, but it's very important work, and you know, I'm certain it's going to take a long time to get to the answers to many parts of that control of invasive species. Certainly, better understanding the food web, if we ever do. You know, that's kind of like understanding life. You know.
Yeah, right. There's always more questions.
That's right. Are there any questions or comments?
Yeah, I'll give you a comment. I think with modern electronic sampling equipment, we can get very big data sets that will contribute to models. You see a big future in that, and then also comment on, you know, going back to historical information and data mining that. I mean, how do you see the balance? A little bit of both, or one or the other?
Both, and I'm happy to say both are underway. The USGS particularly has been very active in developing continuous monitoring equipment. They've got a nutrient set of instruments for nutrient monitoring that they can mount on their boat. Actually, the Delta Regional Monitoring Program has a contract with the USGS. They're going to be doing a set of 9 cruises for us through the Delta, so that's going to start this fall. I'm excited about that. And you're definitely right. There's a lot of information that can be learned from data mining. That's one of the things we hear is, oh, we collect all this data. DWR and USGS have huge amounts of data, but we need the time to go back and work on it. Regional Monitoring Program, Delta Stewardship Council, and DWR recently paid for some data syntheses looking at nutrients. The next steps would be to expand those into the physical factors to get that holistic understanding.
Any further comments? Well, thank you very much, Janice.
Wait.
Whoops. Yes, go ahead, Bob.
As I was listening to this, I kept thinking about Clear Lake and where the applications of process and technology and techniques might be applicable to resolving some of the cyanobacteria problems that they're having there.
The whole suite of, I'm not an expert on cyanobacteria problems in the Clear Lake, definitely, but the whole suite of factors that are described in our cyanobacteria plan, you hear those repeatedly. It's a multi-factor problem: light, residence time, nutrients. What's the recycling of nutrients from particularly phosphorus on the bottom of the lake? Hopefully there will be overlap. That's one of the goals, that as we identify some of these research needs, we'd like to be able to apply them elsewhere. But
Yeah, as I listened to that, that's what I was kind of hoping. But the new thing I heard that I hadn't really thought of is that, you know, some of these bacteria and the nutrients are needed for the bugs living in the water there too. And so you just can't get rid of all of it. You got to get rid of the right amount of it. So it's quite an inexact science, I'd say.
Like management, I hear from people, it's an art. But there are papers out there of looking at the balance between your nutrients and working that with the interacting factors to tamp down on the cyanobacteria growth.
And what nutrient is controlling oftentimes, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's potassium often. And the other nice thing is that there was money in the state budget for looking at Clear Lake, and maybe that'll help move that process along there. And maybe some of that work can help the Delta work.
Exactly.
Any further comments? I'd like to point out it is now 1 minute after 5. We've made our timeline pretty good, and thank you. And
Do we have any public comments on this item?
Yes, are there any public comments? That'll take it to 2 minutes after.
Just making sure. Thank you.
Very good.
Great job, staff.
Great job. So we are now adjourned until October 19th in
It'll be held in Reading, but we will have probably a board workshop and tour the first day.
So we'll be in Northern California.
On the 19th and the 20th, we'll have it
October
at
19th
the
and
City
20th.
Council chambers. We'll have the board meeting.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeannie. Yeah, well, hey. Great staff is a sign.
She's here from 8 to 5, no matter what.
Wait till 5 to leave, just so I can hit the maximum crowd.